come in, come in. The door is unlocked. It always is at this hour. I am Master Aldworth, apothecary. These premises have been mine for 40 years, and before me they belonged to another, and before him to another. Still, old shops accumulate things. Jars, dust, the smell of dried roots and long evenings, knowledge, mostly knowledge. Tonight I want to show you something on the third shelf, third from the left, near the window. A small jar, brown ceramic, unremarkable. The label reads simply Peppermint. You have almost certainly walked past this plant today. Perhaps you pulled one from your garden this very morning and threw it away without a second thought. Most people do. It spreads without permission. It fills whatever space it is given and then quietly takes a little more. People call it a weed. They call it a nuisance. They call it the herb that ate the garden. But this jar has been in apothecary shops like this one for longer than most things humans have made and called important. Dried leaves of this plant have been found inside Egyptian pyramids, sealed there 3,000 years ago by people who considered it too valuable to leave behind. It appears in the first written medical prescriptions we possess. It was used as currency. It was woven into the wreaths of Greek celebrations and laid beside the dead. Roman soldiers carried it. Medieval monks rubbed it on their teeth and tucked it into grain stores and brewed it for soldiers who came home from wars with shaking hands and sleepless nights. It crossed an ocean in the pocket of a settler who could not imagine a garden without it. It became the foundation of an entire American agricultural industry. It entered the official pharmacopoeias of Britain, of Germany, of the European Union. And it is now one of the most consumed herbal teas in the world. And yet most people, when they see it growing in a garden, still think, weed tonight, we are going to correct that. We shall trace peppermint from its mythological origins, for there is a myth, a goddess, a nymph pressed into the earth through the ancient medical traditions of Egypt and Greece and Rome and Persia and China and the Indian subcontinent. We shall sit with the medieval monks who cultivated it in their physic gardens, and the apothecaries who compounded it into waters and plasters and lozenges. We shall follow it across the Atlantic and into the American countryside, where it built fortunes for farming families, who sent it back to the very country it had come from. And we shall arrive eventually at the modern pharmacology that has spent the last century uncovering exactly why 3,000 years of practitioners were right to reach for this jar. It is a long story. I am an old man, and I do not rush. But then you did not come to the shop for something hurried. You came because it is late, and the evening is quiet, and something in you wanted to slow down. That is the right instinct. The shop rewards slowing down. Before we begin in earnest, I would ask one small favor. If you find yourself glad you stepped inside tonight, if the history and the quiet of it suits you, a like, as they call it, or a subscription to the channel, goes a long way toward keeping the candles lit in this shop. These small gestures are how other tired souls find their way here. One quiet recommendation passed along, and I am genuinely curious. Leave a word in the comments. When you are able, tell me where you have traveled from to reach this shop tonight. What city? What country? What corner of the world finds itself awake at this hour, or settling toward sleep? I read everyone. It has become, over time, one of my favorite things about keeping the shop open. Someone in Kyoto at sunrise, someone in Buenos Aires in the afternoon, someone in Edinburgh with the rain doing exactly what Edinburgh rain always does. All of us gathered here around this small brown jar on the third shelf. That is a remarkable thing when you consider it. Now then, settle in. The fire is warm. The rain, if there is rain where you are, is doing its proper work outside the window, and we have a plant of considerable patience waiting to be understood. Let us begin. Mint, such a familiar word, such a familiar smell. You have almost certainly walked past it today, or crushed a leaf between your fingers without thinking very much about it at all. Perhaps you have it growing in a pot near the kitchen window, spreading as it always does, spilling over the edge of its container, the way mint always will if you give it the slightest opportunity. Most people do not think of mint as a plant with a history. They think of it as a flavoring, a garnish, something that freshens the breath, something ordinary. But sit with me here a moment, in the quiet of the shop. The candles are low, the jars are settled on their shelves, and let me show you what is in this one. Brown ceramic, unremarkable to look at. A label reads simply Peppermint, Mentha ex piperita, a hybrid, technically, a cross between watermint and spearmint that does not occur in the wild with any great frequency, and yet has somehow become one of the most widely recognized plants on earth. This jar has been in shops like this one for a very long time indeed. We begin in Egypt, not in the living Egypt of the markets and the river, but in the deep stillness of the tombs, inside the pyramids, sealed away from light and air for centuries. Archaeologists have found dried peppermint leaves, preserved, still faintly aromatic, when they were first uncovered. The dates assigned to these finds range from around 1,000 to 1,500 years before the Common Era, which means that someone more than 3,000 years ago thought it important enough to include in a burial. Consider what that means. The Egyptians were extraordinarily deliberate about what accompanied the dead. Every object in a tomb was chosen with care. Every herb, every resin, every small bundle of leaf matter was placed there for a reason, for use in the afterlife, for ritual protection, or simply because the thing was too valuable to leave behind. Peppermint earned its place among them. We have written evidence from roughly the same period, an Egyptian medical text dating to approximately 1,500 years before the Common Era records peppermint as a remedy for the stomach. For digestive complaints, the text recommends the leaves in preparations designed to calm what we might now call the gut, to settle the cramping and discomfort that comes after difficult digestion. This is the oldest written medical prescription for mint that we possess, and the use it describes peppermint for the stomach is precisely the use that has followed this plant across every civilization, every continent, and every century since. I find that consistency remarkable, not that it surprises me after 40 years in this trade, but it should give pause. When a remedy is written down for the first time in a language that no one alive has spoken for 2,000 years, and it recommends the same preparation for the same complaint that I would reach for this very evening, that is not coincidence, that is observation, repeated and confirmed across so many generations that it has become simply fact. The Egyptians valued peppermint in a more literal way as well. It served in certain periods and contexts as a form of currency, as tribute, as payment. The leaf itself, dried, bundled, weighed, had recognized worth in exchange. This is where the word mint becomes interesting. The English word for the place where coins are made and the English word for the aromatic herb are, by most accounts, related. The connection runs through the Latin motto and the name of a Roman goddess. But the association between fragrant mint leaves and the idea of value of something worth counting and keeping is older than Rome. It runs back to Egypt, to a time when dried leaves in a jar were as good as silver. Greece knew mint as well, and used it rather differently. Where Egypt employed it in medicine and in death, the Greeks wove it into daily life with a particular cheerfulness. Mint became a symbol of hospitality. When guests arrived at a Greek household, the rooms were scented with it. Tables were rubbed with fresh sprigs before a meal was laid. At the end of banquets, those long, careful affairs where food and conversation and philosophy were arranged in a particular order, mint preparations were offered as a final course. The Greeks and Romans placed fresh mint sprays on their tables and used the leaves to flavor sauces and wines. Wreaths of mint, including peppermint relatives, were woven for festive occasions and placed on the heads of guests so that the person sitting across from you at a celebration was quite literally crowned with an aromatic herb that we now associate with digestive health. There is something I like about that image. The medicinal and the celebratory occupying the same leaf, the practical and the ceremonial woven together into a single wreath. That is how herbs were understood before we separated medicine from daily life and put it behind a counter. Pliny the Elder, Roman naturalist, collector of everything, a man who would follow his curiosity into a volcanic eruption and not survive it, wrote about mint with characteristic enthusiasm. He noted that peppermint stimulated appetite, that the smell of it alone prepared the stomach for food. His recommendation was to consume it before meals, not after, which is an interesting reversal of the Greek custom and perhaps says something about the difference between Greek and Roman approaches to a dinner party. Pliny was also interested in mint's more dramatic applications. He and Nicander of Colophon, writing somewhat earlier, both describe mint as a repellent of snakes, leaves rubbed on the skin or scattered around a space were said to deter venomous creatures. Pennyroyal, a close relative, and watermint were specifically noted for treating the bites of snakes, scorpions, and scolopendra, those large and unpleasant centipedes of the Mediterranean world. The treatment involved applying leaf poultices directly or consuming the herb internally to counter venom. Whether these applications worked in any measurable sense is a different question. But the detail is instructive. It tells us that by the 1st century of the Common Era, the mint family had acquired a reputation large enough to extend beyond the kitchen and the physician's cabinet. It was credited with protective properties, with the power to ward off harm. The Babylonian Talmud offers its own unusual entry, a formula involving pennyroyal, eaten with 7 white dates, was prescribed for killing intestinal worms contracted from raw meat. The specificity of that preparation is interesting, not simply mint, but this mint combined with this fruit in this quantity. That kind of precision suggests accumulated practice, not casual suggestion. Someone had tried it, someone had found it worked, or at least appeared to work, often enough to record the aromatic principle they were relying on. The volatile oils that give mint its sharp, clean character would later be applied in the same spirit to peppermint preparations. The plant family shares certain properties across its members. What worked in pennyroyal in Babylon finds its echo in peppermint leaf preparations used across the world for the same category of complaint. And then there is a single reference that reminds us how far mint had traveled in the ancient world even before we begin formally documenting it. In the Bible, in the New Testament, mint appears in the context of tithing. It is listed among the herbs that were considered worthy of a 10th part offering, the same category as more obviously valuable crops, aromatic, medicinal, worth measuring and accounting for, worth giving a portion of to the temple for a plant to appear in a tithing list. It must have had recognized value, not simply as a garden herb, but as something that people grew deliberately in sufficient quantities that it could be assessed and taxed. That is a different kind of evidence than a medical text or a poem. That is administrative evidence. The bureaucracy of the ancient world acknowledging that mint mattered enough to count. So we have, in just this early layer of the record, a plant that was preserved in tombs and prescribed in medical texts, worn in wreaths and rubbed on tables, used as currency and offered in tithes, credited with warding off snakes and settling the stomach alike, valued in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome, in Babylon, in the world of the early biblical texts. And it has been on this shelf in one form or another ever since. Before we move further along the shelf, I want to stay with this jar a moment longer, because peppermint did not arrive in the ancient world carrying only a medical reputation. It carried something older than that, something that medicine and mythology shared. In those early centuries, before the two had been properly separated, it carried a story. The Greeks, who gave us so much of our herbal thinking, also gave us the explanation for why mint smells the way it does, why it is so arresting, so immediate, why a single crushed leaf can stop you mid-thought and pull your attention entirely into your nose. The story concerns a nymph named Minth. Minth, in the telling, was beloved of Hades, the god of the underworld, that quiet, powerful figure who ruled over everything that lies beneath the living earth, had taken notice of her. Whether this was a comfort or a complication to Minth is not entirely clear from the surviving accounts. But it was noticed by someone else, by Persephone, queen of the underworld, wife of Hades, a goddess, who had herself been taken from the upper world and who was not, by most accounts, inclined to patience on the subject of her husband's attentions. Persephone transformed the nymph into a plant. There are variations in the telling. In some versions, it is Demeter, Persephone's mother, who performs the transformation. In others, it is Persephone herself. But the outcome is consistent. Mintha becomes mint. She is pressed into the earth, her form changed. And yet, and this is the part that the Greeks seem to find most significant, she does not disappear. She persists, she spreads. And she retains something of herself, her scent, her particular penetrating, impossible to ignore fragrance, which is perhaps its own kind of voice, if you consider it carefully. The myth does several things at once, as the best myths tend to. It explains the origin of the plant in terms of divine action, which was the Greek way of accounting for things that seemed to carry unusual power, but it also embeds mint in a very particular set of associations. The underworld, the boundary between the living and the dead, a story of transformation and persistence, of something that cannot quite be extinguished. This is why, if you look at the full span of mint's folkloric history, you find it appearing at both ends of what life contains, at celebrations and at funerals, in love charms and in burial rites, associated with fertility and with death in nearly the same breath. Mintha herself, caught between the world above and the world below, between a god of the dead and the goddess who rules what grows, sits precisely at that boundary. The plant that carries her name has always sat there too. Folk belief, across many centuries and many cultures, treated peppermint as a protective herb. Carrying a few dried leaves in a pocket or a small sewn pouch was said to bring good fortune. Planting it near the door of a house, which gardeners would tell you is a questionable idea, since mint will very quickly become the door, and then the path, and then the entire front garden was believed to keep harmful spirits from entering. The plant's sharp, clarifying scent was understood as a kind of barrier, an assertion, something that announced its presence and left little room for things that preferred to go unnoticed. This protective thinking extended into more deliberate ritual practice. Practitioners who worked with herbs in ceremonial contexts placed fresh peppermint on altars, using its scent and its associations to attract benevolent spirits and to sharpen the mind for ritual work. Clarity and courage were the qualities most often cited. The same sharpness that Pliny noticed when he said peppermint prepared the stomach. That quality of waking things up, of cutting through fog, translated into magical thinking as readily as it had into medicine. The herb was also used in healing poppets. Small figures sewn from cloth and stuffed with dried plant matter were a common form of sympathetic magic across European folk traditions. A green poppet, stuffed with peppermint, was thought to carry the plant's cleansing and invigorating properties directly to the person it represented. It is not so very different from the reasoning behind a poultice or a compress. The logic is the same. Bring the herb into contact with the person who needs it. The mechanism is the only thing that differs. Some of the more detailed magical herbals associate peppermint with specific goddesses, Ceridwen, the Welsh keeper of the cauldron of transformation and inspiration, Demeter, the Greek goddess of the grain and of the seasons, Persephone's mother, who some say performed the transformation of Mintha herself, and Hecate, goddess of crossroads and of witchcraft, patron of the liminal and the strange, three different traditions. And yet the qualities they share, transformation, the threshold between states, the passage between what is and what will be, are precisely the qualities that Mintha's story embeds in the plant. The associations are not accidental. They accumulate over centuries of people noticing what the herb seemed to do and reaching for the appropriate mythology to explain it. Wearing peppermint at the wrist or carrying it close to the body was said to support resilience and ward off illness, which sits comfortably alongside the older belief in mints as strengthening tonics, the kind of preparation that builds the body's resources over time rather than treating a specific crisis. The folk belief and the medical belief are saying the same thing in different languages. And then there are the dreams. Peppermint, in some traditions, was used to encourage prophetic dreaming, leaves tucked near the pillow, or combined with calming herbs, lavender being the most common partner in these preparations, was said to make the dreams that followed more vivid, more meaningful, more likely to carry information from whatever it is that speaks to us when we are asleep. I cannot comment on whether this works in any measurable sense. I am an apothecary, not a prophet. But I will say this, peppermint before sleep is not, strictly speaking, the obvious choice from a physiological standpoint. It is a stimulating herb by nature. It wakes the digestion, it clears the head, used in large quantities in the evening. It would keep some people awake rather than drawing them toward rest. And yet the tradition persists. Perhaps the small quantity used in a dream pillow is enough to clarify the mind without agitating it. Perhaps the sharpness of the scent, brief, and then absorbed, creates a particular quality of attention as sleep arrives, or perhaps the tradition is simply older than our current understanding and contains something we have not yet properly described. In more recent folk practice, the kind that is still very much alive and tended carefully by those who work with herbs in ritual contexts, peppermint has found new forms without abandoning its old associations. A tea brewed during the waning moon, when folk magic traditionally focuses on release and letting go, is said to draw out stress and accumulated tension. The same tea, brewed during the waxing moon when the tradition turns toward invitation and growth, is framed as a way of welcoming clarity and good fortune. The moon phase changes the intention. The tea remains the same. The peppermint in the cup does not know what the moon is doing, but the person drinking it does. And that attention, that deliberate framing of an ordinary act as a meaningful one, is itself a kind of medicine. There are those who now spray peppermint infusions through the air of a room, or over objects, or across the space around a person, as a cleansing mist. It is a modern form. Spray bottles are a recent invention, but the idea behind it is the same one that put mint sprays on Greek banquet tables and mint sprigs near Egyptian burial goods. The scent as a kind of purification, an assertion of freshness against whatever has grown stale or heavy. And some practitioners, following a tradition that links peppermint to the intuition and to the particular receptiveness of the third moon of spring, use it specifically to support divination work, to heighten awareness, to open whatever it is in us that notices more than we usually allow ourselves to notice. Mentha, pressed into the earth by a jealous goddess, became a plant that spreads without permission and cannot be extinguished, and fills every room it enters with its presence. There are worse fates. There are worse legacies. And her scent, I would argue, has been doing its quiet work in human life ever since. The mythology, as I said, was never entirely separate from the medicine. The two ran alongside each other for centuries, drawing from the same well of observation, the same accumulation of noticed effects. Mentha pressed into the earth by a goddess, mint rubbed onto skin to ward off serpents. Mint leaves placed near the dead, these things. And the medical prescriptions existed in the same world, held by the same people, used by the same hands. But the physicians were keeping their own records, and their records are worth following carefully. We move forward now into the early centuries of the Common Era, into that long period when the great medical traditions of the ancient world were being gathered, annotated, and carried forward by a succession of careful scholars who built upon each other. Work with the methodical patience of people who understood that knowledge, properly tended, outlasts any single lifetime. Attios of Amida was one such man, a Byzantine physician, working in the 6th century, somewhere between 502 and 575 of the Common Era. He compiled a substantial medical encyclopedia that drew heavily on earlier Greek sources while adding his own clinical observations. Among the remedies he documented were preparations of pennyroyal, the peppermint relative, for two purposes that would have been very familiar to any apothecary of my acquaintance. The first was digestion, pennyroyal leaf teas to settle the gut, ease cramping, support the body as management of what it had consumed. The same application the Egyptian medical text had described 1,000 years earlier. Still working, still being prescribed. The second was the cough. Attios recommended pennyroyal preparations as what we would now call an expectorant, an antitussive, meaning they helped loosen and clear the phlegm that settles in the chest and ease the spasm of persistent coughing. The aromatic volatile oils in the mint family have a particular affinity for the respiratory passages. Anyone who has inhaled deeply over a bowl of peppermint steam will understand this immediately. ATOs understood it in the 6th century, It is the same understanding arriving by the same route. Not long after, Alexander of Trolos, another Byzantine physician, working roughly between 525 and 605 of the Common Era, was using water mint preparations for a rather different purpose. He applied them against intestinal parasites, leaf preparations designed to create an inhospitable environment in the gut for the worms that were a common and unpleasant fact of life in that era. This echoes the Babylonian formula we discussed earlier, pennyroyal with dates for the same complaint. The reasoning was consistent across centuries and cultures. The aromatic compounds in mint were understood to be hostile to things that should not be living inside a person. The volatile oils that give peppermint its character are not, it turns out, welcome to a great many organisms. The body of the infected patient perhaps agreed. Paulus Aegineta, writing in the 7th century, took this anti-parasitic thinking and gave it a particular form that I find quietly interesting. He prescribed mints in rose oil. The two plants combined applied not internally but externally to the navel as a treatment for worm infections in children. There is something very practical about that approach. A child with intestinal parasites is not always easy to persuade into drinking a medicinal preparation, but an oil rubbed gently onto the belly, fragrant with rose and mint, is another matter entirely. Paulus also prescribed mint alongside Sebastian plums for worm-related fevers. The plums were likely chosen for their softening, soothing properties. They were commonly used in preparations designed to ease the body through difficult processes. The mint would have provided its usual combination of aromatic action and digestive support, a compound preparation, addressing the complaint from more than one direction at once. We come now to the 12th century, and to two figures who represent rather different aspects of medieval medicine, but who both left records of mint's continued usefulness. The first is a text known as the Trotula, a collection of medical writings from the school of Salerno in southern Italy, associated in part with a practitioner named Trota. The Salerno school was, in its time, the most celebrated center of medical learning in Europe. I mentioned it when we discussed the dandelion, and it appears again here, because serious physicians came to Salerno from across the known world, and the knowledge that accumulated there was extraordinary in its range. The Trotula was specifically concerned with women's medicine, and it included horsemint, another close relative of peppermint, in a powder preparation given with wine to women during pregnancy. The purpose was the relief of abdominal distension and the risk that came from trapped intestinal gas pressing on the womb. It is a carefully considered use. The volatile oils in the mint family relax smooth muscle, ease the passage of gas through the gut, reduce the uncomfortable swelling that can cause genuine distress. And, in the thinking of the time, genuine danger. Trota, or the tradition that bears her name, also recommended mint water in combination with Galen's great antidote for the treatment of poison wounds, bites from rabid dogs, venom from snakes and other dangerous creatures. Mint leaf extract as part of an emergency preparation for the most serious of presentations. It is a reminder that in medieval medical practice, the division we now make between routine remedies and emergency medicine did not exist in the same way. The same herb that settled a pregnant woman's discomfort was also pressed into service when someone arrived at the door bleeding and frantic. A well-stocked apothecary kept mint not only for the everyday complaints, but for the moments when everything else was also happening at once. Hildegard von Bingen, the Benedictine abbess and polymath of the 12th century, included mints among her considerable catalogue of medicinal plants. Hildegard was not primarily a practitioner of the Salerno school tradition. She worked from a different framework, one that blended natural philosophy with mystical theology in a manner entirely her own. But her observations on plants were rooted in genuine attention to what they did. She credited mints with virtues for digestion and for head complaints, the headache, the foggy thinking that settles after rich food or a night of poor sleep. These are precisely the applications that later practice would ascribe specifically to peppermint. Hildegard was working with the broader family, but the thread runs continuous. Further north, considerably further north, Icelandic pharmacopoeias from around 1240 record peppermint type mints as remedies for indigestion and headache. This is worth pausing on. We are now in the mid-13th century in Iceland, which is about as far from the warm Mediterranean gardens, where mint thrives as it is possible to go while remaining in Europe, and yet peppermint had made it there, had been formalized into the materia medica of northern European medicine, written into the pharmacopoeias, the official reference texts of what a properly stocked physician or apothecary ought to have available. The plant traveled. It always traveled, following the same routes as books and scholars, and the exchange of practical knowledge between people who understood that useful things should be shared rather than kept. Inside the monasteries of medieval Europe, mint had taken on a particular domestic role alongside its medical one. Monks used it to clean their teeth, rubbing fresh leaves directly against the teeth and gums, or making simple powders and rinses from dried and ground leaf matter. The mechanical action combined with the aromatic oils to cleanse the mouth and leave the breath fresh and sharp and decidedly less monastic than it might otherwise have been after a long winter of porridge and stored provisions. Medieval monastic texts describe this practice in terms that blend practical hygiene with something approaching the ceremonial. The mouth, after all, was the instrument of prayer and of sacred reading. Keeping it clean was not merely a bodily concern. Mint was also put to work in the food stores. The strong, sharp odor of stored mint leaves was believed to repel mice from the cheese and grain that represented a monastery's winter provisions. Whether the mice were genuinely deterred is difficult to assess from this distance. But the belief was widespread, the practice consistent, and anyone who has ever kept fresh mint near a kitchen window will have at least anecdotal evidence that certain small creatures find it unwelcome. And then there is the plague, when epidemic disease moved through Europe, and it moved through often. And catastrophically, the aromatic herbs were pressed into service as purifiers. Vinegar preparations containing mint and other sharp-smelling plants were used as protective formulas. The most famous of these was a preparation variously called Four Thieves vinegar, a compound of aromatic herbs steeped in vinegar, said to protect those who used it from contagion. The story attached to it varied, with the telling four thieves who robbed plague victims without becoming ill and revealed their secret when caught. But the formula itself was real and was taken seriously. Mint, with its powerful volatile oils, was among the aromatic herbs included in such preparations. The thinking was coherent within its own framework. If miasma, bad air, corrupt vapor was the vector of disease, then purifying the air with strong aromatics was a rational defense. We now know that disease does not travel by smell. But the herbs in these preparations contained compounds genuinely hostile to many bacteria and pathogens. The reasoning was wrong. The outcome was not entirely without effect. Royal apothecaries, working in the late medieval and early modern period, compounded plasters containing mint leaves alongside bread, cumin, wormwood, and rose. These were prepared for noble patients, for the excesses of aristocratic life, the rich food and the anxious politics, and the epidemic fears that attended court existence, regardless of one's rank. Mint as one component in a careful compound, one thread in a preparation designed to address what too much prosperity and too little restraint tended to produce in a person's digestion. The shop has always served all manner of customers. The complaint, at its root, has always been much the same. There is a thing that happens when you have worked with plants long enough that I can only describe as recognition. You are reading an account from a physician in Persia, or a monastic scholar writing in Latin about northern herbs, or a traveler's description of what the people of some distant land prepare when their stomachs trouble them. And you find yourself nodding, not because you've read it before, but because the plant is the same plant. The complaint is the same complaint. The remedy arrived at independently, by observation, by the same patient attention to what works. Peppermint produces this feeling more than almost any other herb on this shelf. The great medical traditions of Asia developed their understanding of mint along their own lines, using their own frameworks and their own vocabulary. But when you set their conclusions alongside those of the Greek physicians, or the Salerno school, or the medieval monasteries, the agreement is remarkable. Not because knowledge traveled between them, in every case, though it sometimes did, but because the plant itself was teaching them, demonstrating its own properties to anyone patient enough to observe carefully and record what they found. Traditional Chinese medicine assigned to mint species, and in modern practice to peppermint specifically, a set of qualities described as pungent and cooling. The plant was understood to disperse what the tradition called wind heat. This is a term from Chinese medical theory that describes a particular pattern of illness, the feverish, restless kind that affects the head and eyes, that brings rashes to the surface of the skin, that creates a sense of heat and pressure that needs to be moved outward and dispersed rather than suppressed. Peppermint in this framework does exactly that. It clears the head. It opens the eyes. It releases what has become constrained. The tradition also uses it specifically for what it calls constrained liver qi, a phrase that describes a pattern of tension and stagnation, of energy that has become stuck and needs to move again. We would not use those words in this shop, but the underlying observation that peppermint has a dispersing, opening, releasing quality that benefits both the digestive organs and the emotional state is one that appears in European herbalism as well, expressed in entirely different language. The cooling quality is important. Chinese medicine understood peppermint as a herb for conditions of excess heat, not for cold or depleted states. It is not a warming herb in the way that ginger or cinnamon are warming. It creates a sensation of coolness, of freshness, of the kind of clarity that follows when heat has been moved on. This is the same quality that made Greek hosts rub it on their tables and Egyptian embalmers reach for it in the preparation of the dead. The same quality perceived by different observers, described in different terms, applied through different traditions to the same fundamental human experiences. Ayurvedic medicine, the ancient and still living tradition of the Indian subcontinent, understood mint in its own way. Ayurvedic framework is built around the concept of doshas, constitutional principles that govern how the body functions and what it needs. Mint, with its cooling and aromatic character, was placed among the herbs that address excess heat and digestive congestion. It was used for stomach complaints, for headaches, for skin conditions, and for the broader category of what happens when the digestive fire, Agni in the Ayurvedic vocabulary, has been disturbed and needs gentle correction rather than dramatic intervention. Historical accounts from within this tradition describe mint in baths, a whole body application of the herb's cooling and cleansing properties. They describe it in mouth rinses designed to whiten the teeth and heal sores in the mouth. They describe it in preparations for sexually transmitted diseases, where its antimicrobial properties and its capacity to reduce inflammation were applied to a category of complaint that ancient physicians of every tradition found both common and difficult. The Indian Materia Medica records peppermint leaf infusions specifically for vomiting, for gastric colic, and for diarrhea. These are precise designations. Not simply digestive complaint in general, but 3 distinct presentations, each addressed with the same preparation from the same plant. And herbal mixtures containing peppermint feature in traditional Indian practice for indigestion, for coughs, for colds, the same convergent applications we have been tracing since Egypt. In Persia, the tradition of chewing peppermint leaves directly for toothache was well established. A simple, immediate use, no preparation required. You take a leaf, you place it against the painful tooth, and you allow the volatile oils, the menthol and its companions, to do their numbing, anti-inflammatory work directly at the site of discomfort. Iranian medical literature records mint extracts being taken for chest pain and to stop bleeding, alongside the same topical application for the mouth. The numbing quality that makes peppermint so immediately recognizable is, in the mouth, a genuinely useful property. The tissue becomes less sensitive, the pain becomes more distant. It is a temporary relief, not a cure, but sometimes temporary relief is exactly what is needed to get through the night until a more permanent solution presents itself. A recent ethnobotanical study from Kurdistan, published in 2025, which means the observation is current and the practice still living, catalogues peppermint SUs in that region for nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, flatulence, and dyspepsia. 6 distinct digestive complaints, all addressed by the same plant, the same review notes. Its use for respiratory infections, for inflammation of the mouth and throat, treated with leaf teas and gargles and lozenges in forms that would have been entirely familiar to Otyazos of Amida writing 14 centuries earlier. What the Kurdistan Review also notes is the use of peppermint preparations in personal hygiene products, in cosmeceuticals, as the modern vocabulary has it. The antimicrobial and cooling properties of the leaf prized not only for what they do inside the body, but for what they do on its surface. This is not a new application. It echoes the Greek practice of scenting rooms and the monastic practice of cleaning teeth. But it is still active, still being chosen for the same reasons it has always been chosen. Let us go south now, into North Africa. Among the Tuareg people of the Sahara and the Sahel, mint tea is not simply a beverage. It is a ceremony. The preparation of tea, strong, sweet, poured from a height to create foam, served in small glasses, offered repeatedly throughout the day, is a social ritual with its own protocols and its own meanings. Hospitality. Welcome, the marking of time. The creation of shared space between people who have come together in a landscape where shade and water and rest are not taken for granted. The mint in that tea is doing several things at once. It is providing flavor. It is supporting the digestion of whatever food accompanies it. It is contributing its mild medicinal properties to the daily life of people who have no separation between the routine and the remedial. And it is carrying the weight of something much older than any individual cup. The accumulated meaning of mint as a herb of hospitality and welcome running in an unbroken thread from the Greek banquet tables we discussed earlier. In Morocco, mint tea made with spearmint, a close relative of peppermint, sharing many of its properties, is served throughout the day and offered to guests as the first gesture of welcome. You do not sit down in a Moroccan household and begin business without first sitting with mint tea. The tea makes space. It slows things down. It creates the conditions for proper conversation, for the kind of exchange that is worth having. I find it interesting that a plant associated in Greek myth with the underworld, with transformation and loss, should also carry such persistent associations with welcome and warmth and the extension of hospitality. The two things sit together without contradiction in the plant's long history. Perhaps that is because both the threshold of death and the threshold of a house are places where welcome matters most. Broader surveys of the mint family in folk medicine across multiple continents record its use for bronchitis, for nausea, for loss of appetite, for liver complaints, for diarrhea, and for psychological disorders in children. That last application, a reminder that the calming, aromatic quality of mint has always been understood to work on the mind as well as the body. The same ethnomedicinal surveys confirm peppermint's traditional roles in treating fever, colds, digestive disorders, and inflammation of the mouth and throat across Europe, Asia, North Africa, and North America. 4 continents, the same core applications, arrived at through independent traditions, confirmed by independent observation, encoded in independent languages, and still recognizable as the same plant doing the same things. In North America, when European settlers arrived and began to establish their new communities in unfamiliar landscape, they observed the indigenous peoples already using wild mints for digestive complaints. Mint tea for stomach upset, the same preparation made from the local species for the same category of distress. The settlers brought their own tradition of peppermint leaf infusions with them. They found the tradition already waiting. Different plants, closely related, the same knowledge, arrived at through the same careful attention to what grew nearby and what it was capable of. Native Americans in several regions prepared mint teas from local species with such regularity that the practice was noted by early European recorders as equivalent in function, if not in species, to the peppermint preparations of the Old World, which suggests that the properties of the mint family are not a secret requiring special knowledge to unlock. They are available to anyone who grows it, bruises a leaf, and pays attention to what happens next. There is a detail from colonial Australia that I want to share because it illustrates something important about how peppermint's reputation worked in the world. When European settlers arrived on the Australian continent, they found a plant, Eucalyptus pipirita, whose foliage, when crushed, smelled remarkably like English peppermint. The name they gave it reflects this. Pipirita, the same species name as our peppermint, assigned, because the smell was so familiar that it could not be coincidence. And so the settlers used the distilled oil of this unrelated Australian plant as a substitute for peppermint in treating what they called colicky complaints, digestive cramping, and discomfort. They were not being careless. They were following a coherent logic. This plant smells like peppermint. Peppermint relieves this complaint, therefore this plant may also relieve this complaint. The aromatic principle was their guide, and the eucalyptus, though entirely unrelated to mint, did share certain volatile oil properties that gave the reasoning some basis. Similarly, native Australian mint, Prostanthera rotundifolia, a plant that resembles peppermint in its aromatic character, if not its botanical family, was boiled into tea by colonial settlers for coughs, colds, aches, and flatulence, explicitly because peppermint in Europe was used for the same things. The settlers carried the idea of peppermint with them even when they did not have the plant itself. The concept traveled as surely as the seeds. What this accumulation of evidence tells us: Egypt and Greece and Rome, Persia and Arabia and China, the Indian subcontinent and North Africa, North America, and the colonial margins of the known world is not simply that peppermint is a widely used herb. Many herbs are widely used. What it tells us is that peppermint is a plant whose properties are consistent enough and apparent enough that independent observers in vastly different circumstances arrive at essentially the same conclusions about what it does. You can find different frameworks for understanding why it works. Volatile oils acting on smooth muscle receptors. In the language of modern pharmacology, wind, heat, dispersal. In the vocabulary of Chinese medicine, a cooling herb addressing excess pitta. In Ayurvedic terms, a carminative and antispasmodic in the European herbalism of my own tradition. The frameworks differ. They are asking different questions about the same phenomenon and encoding the answers in different conceptual systems. But the phenomenon itself, the relief of cramping, the clearing of the head, the freshening of the breath, the easing of the cough, the cooling of the fever, S-edge, that is the same across all of them. Observed in Egypt before the Common Era, still being observed in Kurdistan in 2025. 3,000 years of consistent record. A plant earns that kind of record slowly through accumulated use, through the quiet word passed between people who have found something that helps, through the practitioner who notes it, and the scholar who copies the note, and the tradition that holds the copy, through the traveler who recognizes a local plant and understands from the shape of its leaf or the sharpness of its smell that they are in familiar territory. Peppermint has earned its record honestly, without drama, without a single dramatic cure or a famous remedy attached to one great moment, simply by being there and being useful and proving itself again and again in every corner of the world where it has been allowed to grow, which, as you may have gathered, is a very large number of corners indeed. We have traveled a considerable distance in a short time: Egypt and Greece and Rome, Persia and Arabia and China, the Indian subcontinent, and the Sahara and the colonial edges of continents that European medicine was still learning to name, and in all of those places, the same plant, the same observations, the same accumulated confidence in what the leaf does when you prepare it carefully and give it to someone who needs it. Now we come closer to home, to the apothecary tradition that I know most directly, to the physicians and herbalists and compounders who built the formal practice of Western medicine from the materials that all of that earlier knowledge had assembled. We begin in Portugal in the 16th century. Garcia de Orta was a physician of considerable learning, a man who had traveled widely and read more widely still, and who brought to his practice the kind of synthesis that comes from genuine curiosity about what other traditions had discovered. He recommended mint water, mixed with mastic powder for vomiting and weakness of the stomach. It is a careful compound, the mint providing its carminative antispasmodic action on the gut, the mastic, a resinous substance from the pistachia tree, contributing its own astringent and settling properties, two plants working in combination, each addressing the complaint from a slightly different angle. The formula was echoed by Cristofio da Costa, a contemporary of de Orta, who continued the same tradition of combining careful observation with practical prescription. Mint water appears in both men's work, not as a curiosity or a folk remedy included out of deference to older practice, but as a serious preparation with a specific therapeutic role. Mint waters, preparations made by distilling or steeping mints in water, capturing the volatile oils in a more concentrated form than a simple leaf infusion, became one of the characteristic products of the apothecary's dispensary through the 16th and 17th centuries. Physicians prescribed them for vomiting, for weakness of the stomach, for the range of gastric disturbances that presented regularly at the counter of any well-frequented shop. They were shelf staples, preparations you made in quantity and kept ready, because the demand was consistent and the need did not give much advance notice. The shift from the simple leaf infusion to the more refined mint water is worth noting. It represents a movement toward greater concentration, greater standardization, greater control over what the patient was actually receiving. The leaf tea is variable, dependent on the quality of the dried herb, the temperature of the water, the length of the steeping. The distilled water is more consistent, more predictable, more like what we would now call a pharmaceutical preparation, and less like what a housewife might make in her kitchen from a bunch of herbs. Both have their place. They always have. The formal recognition of peppermint as a distinct medicinal plant, as opposed to one of several mints used somewhat interchangeably, is generally dated to around 1696 in England. A physician named Dr. Eaton of Hereford made note of its cultivated form, observing it as something sufficiently distinct from the other mints to merit specific attention. His observation was followed in 1721 by the inclusion of peppermint in the London Pharmacopoeia, the official list of recognized medicinal substances compiled for the guidance of physicians and apothecaries across the country. The London Pharmacopoeia was not given to casual inclusions. To be entered in it was to be recognized as a legitimate medicine, properly identified, properly characterized, available for prescription and preparation according to established standards. Peppermint, S. entry in 1721, marks the moment when centuries of accumulated practice received its formal institutional endorsement. The herb that had been in Egyptian tombs was now in the official reference text of 18th century English medicine. Large-scale cultivation for medicinal purposes followed by the mid-18th century. English herb gardens and commercial farms had taken up peppermint as a deliberate crop, grown not simply for kitchen or household use, but specifically to supply the apothecary trade. This was a significant transition. It meant that the quality of the available leaf could be controlled, that reliable quantities could be maintained, and that the strains grown could be selected for the properties most useful to medicine and to the confectionery trade that was also, by this period, developing a considerable appetite for peppermint's flavor. There is something important to understand about peppermint's relationship with cultivation. It is a sterile hybrid, a cross between watermint and spearmint that does not reproduce reliably from seed. This means that every peppermint plant is, in a sense, a cutting from another peppermint plant. The stalks are propagated vegetatively, a runner taken, a root divided, a cutting struck in damp soil. Each plant is a continuation of those before it. The cultivated clones that supplied 18th century English apothecaries were selected from among naturally occurring plants for their particular qualities. Higher oil content, stronger menthol character, more consistent leaf production, and then maintained through this vegetative propagation, generation after generation. Wild forms were regarded as inferior for serious apothecary work. The selection process mattered. The timing of harvest mattered too. Experienced growers took the leaves and flowering tops, just as the flowers opened, at the moment when the oil content in the leaf tissue was understood to be at its peak. This is the kind of knowledge that develops over generations of careful observation, not from a single brilliant insight, but from the accumulated attention of many seasons. Hermann Boerhaave was one of the most influential physicians in Europe during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. A Dutchman based in Leiden, whose students carried his methods across the continent, and whose writings shaped medical education for generations. He recommended peppermint medicinally, and in terms that go considerably beyond the familiar applications we have been tracing. He prescribed it as an antiemetic, for the relief of nausea and vomiting, as a local anesthetic, for the numbing of inflamed or painful tissue. These applications were consistent with what earlier practitioners had observed. But Boerhaave went further. He suggested peppermint as a possible agent for what he described as depressive or psychotic states, early neurological attribution, the idea that the herb's effects on the nervous system extended beyond the relief of spasm and cramping to something more fundamental, to the quality of the mind itself. This is a significant claim for a physician of his standing to make. Boerhaave was not a folk herbalist recording traditional beliefs out of respect for their age. He was a systematic medical thinker with a commitment to rational observation. When he suggested that peppermint might influence the mind, he was not reaching for mythology. He was noting something he had observed or heard reliably reported. The idea would not have surprised the Chinese physicians who used it for constrained liver qi, or the folk practitioners who used it for psychological disorders in children. But coming from Boerhaave, it entered the formal medical discourse in a way that carried particular authority. Reverend Joseph Townsend, writing in the latter part of the 18th century, contributed a precise and useful description of peppermint's action that sits well within the emerging rational therapeutics of his period. He described it explicitly as a spasmolytic, a substance that relieves spasm in smooth muscle, and prescribed peppermint water internally for spasmodic digestive disorders. He also described it as a local anesthetic, a numbing agent whose effects could be applied topically to tissues that were inflamed or hypersensitive. This is careful, considered language, not the vocabulary of folk belief, but of a man trying to describe what the herb actually does in mechanical terms that his medical contemporaries would recognize and be able to evaluate. The spasmolytic action on the gut is what relieves the cramping and bloating. The local anesthetic quality is what numbs the toothache and soothes the inflamed throat. Townsend was not discovering these properties. He was translating them into a language that the 18th century could receive as serious medicine rather than inherited custom. William Mackenzie, working in the 19th century, found a further application that might surprise those who associate peppermint primarily with the stomach. He cited peppermint preparations as a local anesthetic in ophthalmic practice, used around the eyes for numbing and soothing tissue in an area where sensitivity is acute and the margin for error is narrow. This speaks to the consistent property underlying all of these applications. The menthol in peppermint acts on specific receptors, what we now understand as cold-sensitive receptors in the nervous system, creating a sensation of coolness and reduced sensitivity that functions, in practice, as a local anesthetic across a range of tissues. Townsend observed it. Mackenzie applied it to the eye. D'Orta's patients would have noticed it when they drank the mint water. The Persian patient chewing a leaf against an aching tooth was relying on the same property. The mechanism is the same whether you are in Leiden or Lisbon or Kurdistan. The leaf does not change its nature, according to who is asking. In the apothecary shop of my own period and tradition, peppermint appears in preparations for a wide range of presentations. Let me walk through them as I would if a young assistant had come to me asking what this jar was actually for. For the digestive complaints, the applications are most numerous. Carminative use, the relief of gas and bloating, the easing of the cramping that comes from trapped wind, is the oldest and most consistent. A leaf infusion, prepared by pouring boiling water over a small handful of dried leaf, covering the vessel to hold the volatile oils close rather than allowing them to escape into the air, and steeping for 10 minutes before drinking warm. That is the basic preparation. It can be refined into a mint water, concentrated into a tincture, compounded with other herbs for more complex presentations. But the basic preparation is accessible to anyone with a kettle and this jar. For nausea and vomiting, peppermint water taken in small doses at intervals. For spasmodic digestive complaint, the cramping that comes and goes in waves, that is not simple bloating but something more acute, the antispasmodic action of the leaf is specifically indicated. This is what Townsend was prescribing, what the Indian Materia Medica described for gastric colic, what Deorta prepared his mint water for. For the head, the leaf infusion taken internally for headache, particularly the tension headache that settles behind the eyes or across the forehead, that is associated with digestive sluggishness or with prolonged close work in poor light. The cooling action works on the blood vessels of the head with a mechanism similar to what it does in the gut. A gentle relaxation, a release of something that has become constricted and tight. In older apothecary practice, a drop of peppermint essence applied to the temples or the back of the neck was a recognized method for the same complaint, the same volatile oils applied from the outside rather than the inside, reaching their destination by a different route. For the sinuses and the respiratory passages, a strong infusion used as a steam inhalation, the patient leaning over the vessel with a cloth draped over the head to hold the vapor close, breathing slowly and steadily while the aromatic compounds open what has become congested. For sore throats and catarrhal inflammation, a gargle of cooled peppermint infusion. For coughs, the leaf tea taken warm. Several times a day, with honey if the patient needs persuading. For the mouth, the practice of chewing peppermint leaves to freshen the breath and clean the teeth is as old as any application we have discussed, and it underlies in ways that most people who reach for a modern toothbrush do not consider essentially every flavored dental preparation made in the world today. The antimicrobial properties of peppermint's volatile oils are not cosmetic. They do actual work in the mouth. They reduce the bacterial load on the surfaces of the teeth and the tissue of the gums. The freshening of the breath is a pleasant side effect of this activity, not the primary mechanism. For the skin and the scalp, diluted peppermint preparations applied topically to soothe irritation, to cool inflamed tissue, to address the itching that accompanies certain skin conditions. In broader mint tradition, applications to the scalp have been associated with remedies for hair loss, a use that appears in the historical literature with enough consistency to suggest that people observed something worth noting, even if the mechanism was not well understood for the nerves. As a mild calmative and analgesic, peppermint leaf tea has a long history in the management of menstrual cramps, general muscle tension, and low-grade pain. The antispasmodic action that relaxes the gut wall applies equally to other smooth muscle tissue. The calmative quality, the sense of ease and clarity that follows a cup of well-made peppermint tea was enough for folk herbalism to reach for it in moments of general discomfort and distress, as a gentle settling agent when nothing more dramatic was warranted. Bohaviev's attribution of neurological effects to peppermint was, in its way, the beginning of a thread that has never entirely been dropped. The formal herbalists who came after him classified peppermint as aromatic, calmative, nervine, and antispasmodic. That last term, nervine, indicating an herb whose action specifically supports and settles the nervous system, not in the dramatic way of the strong sedatives and narcotics that have their own shelf in the shop, but in the quieter way of something that eases the nervous tension that underlies so many complaints, that takes the edge off the hypervigilance that prevents the stomach from digesting and the mind from resting. We end this section of the account with the formal pharmacopoeial record, because Peppermint's journey from the Egyptian tomb to the London pharmacopoeia of 1721 to the European pharmacopoeia of the present day is not a journey that fades into obscurity as modern medicine takes over. It is a continuous line. The European pharmacopoeia formally defines peppermint leaf, Mentha ex piperita, folium, as the dried leaf for use in teas and other oral preparations. The European Union Herbal Monograph recognizes peppermint leaf preparations as traditional herbal medicinal products for the symptomatic relief of digestive disorders, including dyspepsia and flatulence. It specifies that the leaves may be used as comminuted herbal tea or in solid and liquid oral dosage forms, which is to say, as teas, powders and tinctures, the forms that apothecaries have been preparing since the 16th century and that households have been making since considerably before that. Health Canada, as monograph for peppermint, lists the dried leaf as the medicinal part, not the oil alone, not a standardized extract, not a pharmaceutical derivative. The leaf, the same thing that has been in this jar and jars like it across every century since mint was pressed into the earth. That continuity is worth sitting with for a moment. We live in an era of considerable medical sophistication. The pharmacology of peppermint is now understood at the level of receptor binding and enzyme inhibition, and the precise chemical structures of the volatile compounds that give the leaf its character. That knowledge is real and it is valuable, and it has refined how we understand what this plant does. But the dried leaf in the pharmacopoeia is still the dried leaf. The preparation recommended in the EU monograph is still the tea. The dosage form that Health Canada recognizes as a legitimate natural health product is still the infusion that a household in Iceland was preparing in 1240, that a monk was rubbing on his teeth in a Benedictine scriptorium, that an Egyptian physician was prescribing for the stomach before the Greek alphabet existed. The sophistication of our understanding has changed. The plant has not. Medicine in times of war is a particular kind of practice. It asks the practitioner to work quickly, with limited supplies, in conditions that are nothing like the quiet of a well-ordered shop. The elegant compound preparations, the carefully calibrated doses, the time to observe and adjust. These luxuries disappear. What remains is the knowledge of what works simply and quickly, what can be prepared from whatever is to hand, and what will provide some measure of relief when relief is the most that can be offered. Peppermint has always been suited to these conditions. It is portable, it dries well and keeps well. Its preparations are not complicated, and it addresses several of the complaints that attend large groups of men living badly in difficult circumstances: digestive trouble, coughs and sore throats, pain, nausea, and the particular misery of toothache, which does not excuse itself during wartime any more than at any other time. During the American Civil War, peppermint appeared in the medical supplies and the field practice of both sides in several distinct forms. Peppermint oil and tinctures prepared from the leaves were used to mask the taste of other remedies. The medicines of that era were frequently unpleasant, and a practitioner who could make them palatable had a meaningful advantage in convincing patients to take them. The strong, familiar flavor of peppermint was employed in this way, as a vehicle that made the medicine easier to swallow in the literal sense. Peppermint lozenges were issued for sore throats, coughs, and nausea. Small, portable, requiring no preparation at the point of use. They could be carried in a pocket and given to a man who was coughing through the night in a damp encampment, or suffering the nausea that attended fever and poor food, and the accumulated stress of prolonged military service. The lozenge form is one of the oldest prepared medicines we know of. Compressed or molded doses of medicinal material combined with sugar or other binding agents, and peppermint's application in this form represents the intersection of its older traditions with the emerging industrial capacity to produce standardized preparations in quantity. External application was also practiced. Peppermint oil applied to the skin for what the medical literature of the period called paralytic complaints: numbness, weakness, pains, aches, cold, tumors, the variety of presentations that followed injury or prolonged exposure, or the neurological aftermath of trauma. The stimulating quality of peppermint applied to the surface of the skin, the warming, counter-irritant effect that follows the initial cooling sensation, was used to encourage circulation in areas that had become cold and sluggish, to wake up tissue that had retreated into numbness. This is the same quality that later appeared in the chest rubs and plasters of domestic medicine, applied to a soldier's damaged limb or painful joint. It represented the same understanding. Peppermint on the skin does not simply cool. After the initial coolness passes, it stimulates. It brings blood to the area. It creates, in the tissue beneath, a kind of warmth that is not present in the surrounding air. And the toothache, the Civil War's field surgeons dealt with dental pain regularly in men who had not had access to proper dental care and who were living on rations that did not favor the health of teeth. A drop of peppermint oil on a small piece of cotton placed in the cavity of the aching tooth, the same application. The Persian folk tradition had practiced with fresh leaves, the same numbing principle that Paulus Aegineta understood in the 7th century, now refined into the concentrated oil extracted from the leaves and available in a small bottle that could be carried in a medical kit. The practitioner changes. The century changes. The leaf's numbing property does not. 7 years after the Civil War ended, on the streets of London in 1877, vendors were selling peppermint lozenges as cough preventives. Street medicine, the kind sold from barrows and baskets at busy corners, accessible to people who could not afford a physician. Consultation, or an apothecary, compound preparation, relied on a small repertoire of familiar, trusted, inexpensive remedies. Peppermint lozenges, made from herbal extracts, were among them. Their purpose was the soothing of inflamed throats and the easing of the cough that attended the damp, coal, smoke, laden air of the Victorian city. London in 1877 was not a kind place to breathe. The air was thick with the products of industry and domestic coal fires, and respiratory complaints were among the most common presentations in any practice that served the urban poor. A penny lozenge of peppermint, dissolved slowly in the mouth on a cold afternoon, offered genuine relief. Not a cure, but genuine relief, and available to anyone with a penny. The battlefield and the street stall represent the edges of peppermint's domestic career. The moments when its ordinary household applications were adapted to extraordinary circumstances. But the ordinary circumstances are where the herb has spent most of its time in European life, and they deserve their own consideration. By the 18th century in England, peppermint had become a staple of the household garden. Not an exotic import, not a specialist crop available only through apothecary suppliers, but something grown in the kitchen garden alongside the other aromatic and medicinal herbs that every household with any pretension to self-sufficiency maintained. The leaves were harvested through the growing season, dried, and stored for use through the winter months when the plant had retreated into the soil. The household uses were numerous and not sharply distinguished from each other. The same preparation might be medicine one day and refreshment the next. The same jar served the sick child and the healthy adult seeking a warming drink on a cold evening. This blurring of the line between medicine and daily life is characteristic of how herbs were used in ordinary households, and it is worth preserving in the account rather than imposing a distinction that the people who used these preparations would not have recognized. For fevers, peppermint was understood as a diaphoretic, a substance that promotes sweating and thereby assists the body in reducing elevated temperature. The preparation was simple, a hot infusion of the leaves, drunk as warm as the patient could manage, followed by rest under blankets. The body, encouraged by the volatile oils and the warmth of the liquid, would begin to perspire. The fever, in this understanding, was being moved outward and released through the skin rather than remaining trapped and building inside. This is one of those applications where the traditional understanding and the modern pharmacological one converge without quite overlapping. Sweating does contribute to fever management in certain circumstances. The volatile oils in peppermint do have effects on temperature regulation. But the traditional practitioner did not need to know the mechanism to observe that the preparation helped, and helped consistently enough to become a household standard across centuries. Peppermint was combined with elder and yarrow for fevers, colds, and influenza, a classic combination that appears in household herbalism across Europe, with the regularity of a formula that had proven itself over many generations. Elder for its own diaphoretic and antiviral properties, yarrow for its ability to promote sweating and reduce inflammation, peppermint providing its aromatic, opening, clarifying quality to the blend. The three plants together addressing the acute febrile illness from several directions at once. For the stomach, the household applications were as varied as any apothecary's dispensary. Simple leaf tea for nausea and vomiting, peppermint water for the cramping and spasm of colic. The same preparation given to children and adults alike. The dose adjusted for size and severity. In Victorian households, peppermint tea was standard treatment for what they called stomach flu. The combination of nausea, vomiting, loose bowels, and general misery that we would now recognize as gastroenteritis. When a doctor was not summoned, which in most households was most of the time, peppermint tea was what the family reached for. A nursing manual by Isabel Robb, published in the late 19th century, recommended peppermint water specifically for infant colic. The spasmodic abdominal pain that makes the very small uncomfortable in ways they cannot explain, and their parents anxious in ways they find equally difficult to articulate. The recommendation reflects professional endorsement of a practice that had been common in households long before any nursing manual thought to record it. Mothers had been giving dilute peppermint preparations to colicky infants for generations. Robb was confirming what domestic experience had already established. Peppermint syrups, made by infusing the leaves in sugar syrup and straining the result, served a double purpose in household and apothecary practice alike. The syrup was itself a remedy for coughs, colds, and digestive upset, but it was also a vehicle. Other medicines, bitter or unpleasant, could be combined with peppermint syrup in such a way that the patient, particularly the young patient, would accept them without the resistance that made dosing difficult. This is not a minor matter. A medicine that is refused or spat out is no medicine at all. Peppermint's flavor made other medicines possible. Tinctures of peppermint, leaf extracts made with alcohol as the solvent rather than water, were prepared for longer storage and more concentrated dosing. The standard household direction was 10 to 15 drops in water or tea, taken 3 or 4 times daily for gas, heartburn, colic, nausea, and upset stomach. These are precise dosing instructions of the kind that suggest accumulated clinical experience. Enough drops to be effective, not so many as to cause irritation. The tincture allowed a household to have peppermint available through the winter months in a concentrated form that would last properly stoppered for a year or more. For the chest and the respiratory passages, the household preparations were several. Steam inhalation was the most labor-intensive, but often the most immediately effective. Peppermint leaves steeped in a basin of very hot water, the patient leaning over it with a cloth draped over the head to hold the vapor close, breathing slowly while the aromatic compounds opened the congested passages of the nose, sinuses, and upper chest. For sinusitis, for head colds, for the bronchial congestion that follows a winter illness and refuses to clear. The steam treatment offered relief that was evident within minutes of beginning. Chest plasters and ointments compounded with peppermint, applied to the chest and back for bronchitis, for pleurisy, for the rheumatic pains that settled in the muscles of people who spent long hours in the cold, provided a different route to a similar result. The counter-irritant effect of peppermint applied to the skin drew blood to the area, creating warmth and stimulating the local circulation. The aromatic volatile oils, inhaled from the plaster through the night, continued the work of the steam treatment in a more sustained and passive way. The patient slept, and the peppermint worked on. Vapor rubs blending peppermint with eucalyptus. The pairing that the Australian colonial settlers had already intuited became a household standard for nasal congestion and colds in later centuries, a combination that is still manufactured and applied in essentially the same spirit today. The bath offered its own applications. Peppermint tub, teas, large quantities of the herb infused in hot bath water, were used to invigorate the circulation, ease sore muscles after hard labor, and promote sweating in the management of fevers. The whole body immersion meant that the volatile oils were absorbed through the skin and inhaled simultaneously, a thoroughness of application that a simple cup of tea could not provide. For a person deep in the misery of a winter illness, a peppermint bath followed by being wrapped warmly in bed was considered a serious therapeutic intervention rather than mere comfort. Peppermint-infused honey was another household preparation that combined 2 of the most trusted natural medicines into a single product. Dried peppermint leaves steeped in raw honey for several weeks, the honey drawing out the volatile compounds from the leaf tissue. The result strained and stored. The infused honey served as a soothing cough remedy, a spoonful dissolved in warm water or taken directly. It was applied to minor burns where both the honey's known wound-healing properties and the peppermint's cooling, analgesic effect contributed to the management of the injury. And it served as a general digestive aid, a more palatable form of the herb, for patients who found the tea too strong or too sharp for comfortable drinking. The same preparations that were taken internally were also applied externally for insect bites and irritated skin. The cooling, counter-irritant quality of the leaves worked on inflamed skin much as it worked on inflamed internal tissue, reducing the sensitivity, easing the discomfort, creating the conditions for the irritation to settle. A piece of cloth soaked in cold peppermint infusion, laid against a bite or a rash, was a simple and accessible treatment that required nothing more than what any kitchen with peppermint in the garden could provide. And then there are the household uses that are not, strictly speaking, medicinal at all, though the line is difficult to draw cleanly. Before window screens made the question less urgent, households in colonial America placed peppermint in vases on dining tables to discourage flies from settling near food. The strong, sharp scent was understood to be unwelcome to insects, and in the experience of people who lived in close proximity to livestock and summer heat, anything that reduced the fly population in the kitchen and dining room was taken seriously as a contribution to household health. Crushed peppermint, spearmint, and catnip leaves were sprinkled on ant trails in the floors and corners of early American homes. Wreaths and strewing bundles of peppermint and other aromatic herbs were hung in doorways and laid on floors, serving simultaneously as insect repellents, air fresheners, and, by the folk belief we have already discussed, spiritual protectors of the household threshold, the practical and the magical sitting together in the same bundle of dried herb as they had in the Egyptian tomb and the Greek banquet room, without any sense that the combination was unusual. I mentioned the monks keeping peppermint near their grain stores to discourage mice, the frontier American household strewing peppermint across the floor to discourage ants. Both are acting on the same understanding. This plant's smell is offensive to certain creatures that we would prefer not to share our food with. It is a pest control application of the same volatile oils that soothe a human stomach and clear a human head. The property is the same, the organism on the receiving end differs. Over the centuries that brought peppermint from the formal apothecary preparation into the everyday household, a gradual change occurred in how people related to it. The leaf infusion that was initially prepared as medicine, measured, dosed, given to the sick, became, over time, a drink that perfectly healthy people made for themselves on ordinary evenings, for no reason more specific than that. It was pleasant and settling and had a quality of clearing the mind after a long day. This is a shift worth acknowledging. Peppermint tea in the modern world is frequently drunk by people who are not treating any particular complaint. They make it because they enjoy it, because the smell of it is pleasing, because the warmth and the slight cooling sensation that follows the heat of the cup are agreeable in combination, because something about the ritual of making it, the hot water over the leaves, the brief wait, the first careful sip, is itself calming in a way that has nothing to do with pharmacology. This is not the medicine failing to be medicine. It is the medicine succeeding so thoroughly over so many centuries that it has been absorbed into daily life. The boundary between remedy and refreshment has not been erased. It has simply become comfortable to sit on both sides of it without anxiety. In several traditional systems, peppermint has always been combined with other herbs to achieve effects that no single plant can produce alone. The blend with elder and yarrow for fevers, the combination with ginger for digestive complaints, where the warming, moving quality of ginger complements the cooling, relaxing quality of peppermint in a way that addresses the breadth of the presentation rather than only one aspect of it. The pairing with chamomile for the anxious stomach, the nervous cramping that has its origins in the mind rather than the gut and needs to be approached from both directions simultaneously. These multi-herb formulas represent a kind of accumulated clinical wisdom about which plants work well together, which properties complement each other, and which combinations produce a result that is more than the sum of their individual parts. The apothecary who compounds them is not guessing. They are working from a tradition built over many generations of practitioners who tried combinations, noted the results, and passed the knowledge forward. Peppermint has been a reliable partner in all of these combinations because its properties are broad enough to be useful in many contexts, and specific enough to add something that other herbs do not. The aromatic quality improves palatability. The carminative action addresses the gas and bloating that accompany a wide range of digestive complaints. The cooling, antispasmodic character settles smooth muscle in both the gut and the respiratory passages, and the nervine quality, that gentle settling of the nervous system that Boharvid noted, and that herbalists have classified as calmative, means that peppermint contributes something useful whenever the complaint has a component of tension or anxiety, which in human illness is more often than not. It is, in the vocabulary of my trade, a well-rounded herb, not one of the dramatic, powerful plants that act sharply on a single system and require careful handling, not a plant for crises, but for the ordinary human business of managing digestion, colds, headaches, minor pain, and the accumulated tension of daily life. For all of that, and in combination with other herbs for more complex presentations, there are few plants on this shelf that have proven more consistently, more broadly, more enduringly useful. There is a pattern that repeats itself in the history of useful plants. A thing is valued in one place, carried to another, and then through some combination of favorable soil and commercial ambition, and the particular energy of people who have arrived somewhere new, and are determined to make something of it, it takes root so thoroughly in its adopted home that the direction of trade eventually reverses. What was once imported becomes exported. The colony supplies the mother country. Peppermint followed this pattern with a thoroughness that I think would have surprised the English apothecaries who first sent it westward. Rootstock arrived in the British colonies of North America sometime in the late 18th to early 19th century, already recognized as a valuable medicinal hybrid with an established commercial reputation. The first evidence of it entering colonial commerce arrives somewhat earlier, in the 1760s, when advertisements for imported peppermint essence appeared in American colonial publications. The language of these advertisements is instructive. They claimed cordial and stomachic effects, the same language that the London apothecary trade had long used. Rapid relief of colic and windy pains. These were the applications that the colonial buyer recognized and trusted, because they were the same applications they had known from household practice in England before crossing the Atlantic. The distinction between imported and domestic was immediately present. Colonial druggists stocked both what they called true English peppermint essence and locally produced versions, mirroring the broader pattern of the colonial medicine trade, which consistently valued the imported as more authoritative, while simultaneously developing the domestic as more affordable. The word true is worth noting. It implies that the domestic version might be questioned, that provenance carried something, a guarantee of quality, association with the established English cultivation that had been supplying the London pharmacopoeia since 1721. The colonial consumer, uncertain about the domestic product, could pay more for the reassurance of the English label. By the 1790s, peppermint was being commercially cultivated in Massachusetts, specifically for distillation. Similar operations appeared in northern New York and New Jersey in short order. The establishment of these plantations was not simply a matter of growing what would otherwise be imported. It was the creation of a new rural industry, built around the particular requirements of peppermint cultivation, the selection and vegetative propagation of high-quality clones, the management of fields that could spread aggressively but needed to be maintained in productive condition, the harvesting at the precise moment of optimal oil content, and the distillation of the harvested leaf and flowering tops into the concentrated essence that the trade required. Early American peppermint oil from these new plantations was sold directly to households, often peddled door to door by traveling vendors who understood that peppermint was not a luxury but a staple, something that families expected to have available and would buy from whoever presented themselves at the door with a reliable product at a reasonable price. The political pressures of the early 19th century added further impetus to domestic production. The Embargo Act of 1807, which restricted trade with Britain in the context of the conflicts that would eventually become the War of 1812, created genuine incentive to develop American sources for medicinal essences that had previously been imported. American leaders actively promoted domestic peppermint cultivation as a matter of economic self-sufficiency. A country that could supply its own medicine cabinet from its own fields was less vulnerable to the disruptions of international trade and the political complications that attended the relationship with Britain. This is an interesting moment in the herb's history. Peppermint, which had traveled from England to the colonies as a valued import, was now being grown in American fields as a statement of independence. The medicinal plant had acquired a political dimension. The families who built the American peppermint industry became known in the regional memory of New England and the northern states as the Peppermint Kings. The Rannies of Connecticut were among the earliest growers in New York, Ohio, and Michigan followed, expanding the cultivation westward as the new nation expanded. These were large operations, not household gardens, plantations organized around the distillation of leaf oil in purpose, built stills producing concentrated peppermint essence in quantities that supplied not only the domestic American market, but, remarkably, the export trade. By the middle of the 19th century, American peppermint oil was being exported back to Britain and to Europe in significant volumes. The plant that had traveled from English herb gardens to colonial apothecary shops was now returning across the Atlantic in distilled form, grown by American farmers on American soil, supplying the same English and European markets that had once supplied the colonies. The reversal is almost elegant, a sterile hybrid that can only be propagated by taking cuttings from existing plants. Every peppermint field, a continuation of every peppermint field before it, had traveled across an ocean through the deliberate choices of people who knew what they were carrying and why, and had then multiplied so thoroughly in its new home that it outcompeted the original. The rural economies built around this cultivation were genuinely significant for farming communities in Dutchess County, in New York, in the mint regions of Michigan. The peppermint crop was not a supplement to other agricultural work. It was the primary product. The knowledge of how to grow it, harvest it at the right moment, and distill the oil correctly was a skilled trade. The stills themselves were investments of real capital. The Peppermint Kings were not small operators making do. They were commercial farmers building businesses around a plant that the world, as it turned out, had a very large and very consistent appetite for. This appetite has not diminished. The global trade in peppermint, of which those early American plantations were the beginning, is now measured in thousands of tons of oil annually. The leaf that was placed in Egyptian tombs is now grown on an industrial scale across multiple continents, processed in facilities that would be unrecognizable to the Hereford physician who first formally noted the cultivated plant in 1696, and consumed in forms that range from pharmaceuticals to confectionery to the everyday cup of tea. The plant, as ever, does not seem troubled by the scale of the attention. It simply continues growing. There comes a point in the history of any well-established remedy when the accumulated weight of practice demands formal acknowledgement, when the knowledge that has been passed from practitioner to practitioner, recorded in herbals and pharmacopoeias and nursing manuals and the margins of household receipt books, becomes sufficiently large and sufficiently consistent that the institutions of official medicine cannot reasonably continue to ignore it. For peppermint leaf, that process of formal recognition has been long and layered. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way most things happen in medicine, gradually, cautiously, with each generation of regulatory bodies acknowledging a little more of what the previous generation of practitioners had already known. We have already noted that peppermint entered the London Pharmacopoeia in 1721. That was the beginning of the formal record in Britain. What followed over the next 3 centuries was an expanding body of official acknowledgement across Europe that tracked the plant as established uses with increasing precision, translating the language of household practice and apothecary tradition into the terminology of modern pharmaceutical regulation. The European Scientific Cooperative on Phytotherapy, known as ESCOP, a body established in the late 20th century to provide scientific and regulatory assessment of herbal medicines, cites traditional peppermint leaf use for the symptomatic treatment of dyspepsia, flatulence, and gastritis. These are the same indications that Garcia de Orta was prescribing mint water for in the 16th century, that Townsend was describing in the 18th, that Victorian households were treating with kitchen, made leaf tea when a doctor was not summoned. The vocabulary has been updated. The indications are unchanged. The British Herbal Compendium, the reference text that formalizes traditional British herbal medicine practice, lists peppermint leaf specifically for dyspepsia, flatulence, intestinal colic, and biliary disorders. That last category is worth pausing on, biliary disorders, the gallbladder and its relationship to the liver and to digestion. We encountered this territory in the dandelion's history, the ancient physician's recognition of the liver as central to digestive health and of bitter herbs as the primary support for its function. Peppermint's role in biliary complaints is different from the dandelion's. It acts more as an antispasmodic, relaxing the smooth muscle of the bile ducts and gallbladder, than as a bitter tonic stimulating bile production. But the underlying recognition that this herb has something specific to offer the hepatobiliary system connects peppermint to the same ancient tradition. European sources record the use of peppermint leaf infusions for what they describe as hepatobiliary dysfunction, sluggish liver, biliary disorders. These are precisely the conditions for which the apothecaries of earlier centuries would have reached for bitter herbs and cholagogues, substances that promote the flow of bile and support the liver's management of digestion. Peppermint's inclusion in this category reflects the observation, consistent across centuries, that the antispasmodic relaxation it produces in smooth muscle is beneficial not only in the gut but in the biliary passages that connect the liver to the digestive system. The traditional monographs assembled from historical sources record a list of indications for peppermint leaf that reads like a summary of everything we have been discussing this evening. Epigastric distension, sluggish digestion, belching, flatulence, intestinal spasms, dyspeptic ailments, spasmodic colitis, an adjuvant role in promoting renal and digestive elimination, meaning that peppermint was understood not only to settle the gut, but to support the kidneys in their work of clearing the body of what had accumulated, a mild diuretic role alongside the more prominent carminative one. For the respiratory passages, nasal congestion, common cold, bronchitis treated with hot infusions and inhalations in forms that any household of the past 3 centuries would have recognized immediately. For the mouth and throat, washes and pastilles for buccal and oropharyngeal pain, the technical terms for what the apothecary called a sore throat and a tender mouth, relying on what the regulatory documents now formally describe as the leaf's mild anodyne action. Anodyne, pain relieving, the same numbing quality that the Persian patient relied on when chewing a leaf against a toothache, now formally classified and entered into the language of European pharmaceutical regulation. For oral hygiene, mouthwashes, for general cleanliness and breath freshening, the monk rubbing mint on his teeth in the scriptorium. The preparation entering the EU assessment report as a recognized traditional use, centuries apart, the same application. The German Commission E, the expert body that assessed herbal medicines in Germany with particular thoroughness and rigor, approved peppermint leaf for cramp-like complaints of the gastrointestinal tract and of the gallbladder and bile ducts. The language is precise. Cramp-like complaints, this is the antispasmodic indication that Townsend described, that the trochlea addressed in pregnant women, that nursing manuals recommended for infant colic. The German Commission, working from clinical evidence and traditional use assessment together, arrived at the same conclusion as everyone who had been paying careful attention to this plant for the past 1,000 years. Commission E also listed peppermint leaf for nausea, vomiting, and meteorism, that last term being the formal word for the uncomfortable accumulation of gas in the digestive tract, meteorism, a dignified word for something that has been undignified in every century since the Egyptians first recorded its treatment. The French regulatory authorities added their own contributions to the official record in a form that I find particularly thorough. French official bulletins recognized peppermint leaf preparations for promoting renal and digestive elimination, the mild diuretic and depurative role that the European tradition had always attributed to it. France also authorized topical peppermint leaf products as soothing and antipyretic treatments for dermatological ailments, cracked skin, grazed skin, chapped skin, and insect bites. These are the same external applications that household medicine had been practicing for centuries. The cooling compress on the rash, the leaf preparation on the insect bite, the soothing action on skin that has been damaged or irritated. What the French classifications show is a plant formally straddling two regulatory categories: internal digestive medicine and external skin treatment. This is not an unusual position for peppermint. It has always occupied both. The property that relaxes smooth muscle in the gut is the same property that cools and soothes inflamed skin. The volatile oils that clear the congested head when inhaled over a bowl of steam are the same volatile oils that reduce the itch of an insect bite when applied topically. The plant does not change its nature between its internal and external applications. The regulatory frameworks that have assessed it have simply had to accommodate the breadth of what it does. The EU Assessment Report, in its comprehensive survey of peppermint leaf's traditional and documented uses, produces a list that deserves to be read carefully because it shows the full range of what traditional practice has attributed to this plant over the centuries of recorded history. Bronchitis, bacillary dysentery, diabetes, diarrhea, dysmenorrhea, painful menstruation, which folk herbalism had addressed with leaf tea as a mild analgesic and antispasmodic, since well before any regulatory body thought to assess the practice. Fevers, jaundice, nausea, pain of various kinds, respiratory and urinary tract infections. The same report notes folk uses as an emmenagogue, a substance that promotes menstrual flow, as a vermifuge for expelling intestinal parasites, an application that runs back through Paulus Aegineta and Alexander of Tralles to the Babylonian Talmud formula with pennyroyal and dates, as a lactation enhancer, and as a sedative, a calming agent, the nervine quality that the folk tradition has recognized in mild preparations of this herb for as long as it has been used. This is a large and varied list for a single plant, but I would observe that it is not a random list. It is not a collection of desperate claims made on behalf of an herb with nothing genuine to offer, hoping that sheer volume of alleged applications will substitute for demonstrated effect. It is a list that coheres around a central set of properties: antispasmodic, carminative, cooling, mildly, analgesic, antimicrobial, aromatic, and shows what those properties look like when applied to the full range of human complaints that share those features. Cramp is cramp, whether it is in the gut or the uterus. The antispasmodic action addresses it in both places. Fever requires the body to manage heat. Peppermint's diaphoretic and cooling properties contribute to that management in more than one way. The antimicrobial character of the volatile oils is relevant to respiratory infections and to the bacterial burden in the mouth and gut alike. The sedative quality that soothes the nervous system is useful in the anxious stomach, in the dysmenorrhea that worsens with tension, in the insomnia that follows a day of accumulated stress. The list is long because the properties are genuinely broad, and the regulatory bodies have confirmed this cautiously in the language of their own particular methodologies, but confirmed it nonetheless. There is a detail in the chemical composition of the dried peppermint leaf that I want to draw attention to, because it speaks to something important about how we should understand this herb in relation to the simplified picture that popular culture sometimes presents. Dried peppermint leaf contains up to 4% essential oil. That oil, the mental, rich volatile fraction that gives peppermint its immediate, recognizable character, is what most people think of when they think of peppermint's medicinal activity. Mental, on the cold receptors, the cooling sensation, the clearing of the head. It is the most obvious and most immediately perceptible of the leaf's properties. But the leaf also contains tannins, flavone glycosides, and triterpene acids. These are not the same as the volatile oil. They do not evaporate when you make a tea. They are present in the infusion, alongside the aromatic compounds, contributing their own activities. The tannins with their astringent tissue toning properties, the flavonoids with their antioxidant and anti-inflammatory character, the triterpene acids with their own documented biological effects. The dried leaf is, in the language of modern pharmacology, a complex polypharmaceutical. Not simply a menthol delivery system, but a preparation containing multiple active components that work in combination with each other and with the body's own chemistry in ways that are not yet fully characterized. This complexity is part of why the leaf preparation, the simple tea, the infusion, the preparation that has been made in kitchens and apothecary shops for 3,000 years, retains its place in the official monographs alongside the purified essential oil and the standardized extracts. The leaf does things that the oil alone does not do, because it contains things that the oil does not contain. The whole is, in the oldest and most literal sense of the phrase, more than the sum of its parts. The EU monograph defines peppermint leaf, Mentha ex piperita L. Folium, as the medicinal substance in its own right, distinct from the oil and the extract, with its own recognized indications and its own recognized forms of preparation. That definition is not a concession to tradition. It is a recognition that the traditional preparation has genuine value that would be lost if the leaf were simply reduced to its most obvious constituent. The monograph does carry one restriction that reflects the caution of modern regulation regarding the very young traditional leaf products are indicated for adolescents over 12 years of age. This is a more conservative position than folk practice has historically taken. Nursing manuals recommended peppermint water for infants, as we have discussed, and households across Europe gave dilute mint preparations to young children for colic and digestive upset without evident harm. The regulatory restriction reflects a precautionary approach to the potency of menthol in young children rather than evidence of demonstrated harm. The folk tradition and the official monograph are in mild disagreement here, and I note it without resolving it. Both are working from their own kinds of evidence. The practitioner must exercise judgment, as practitioners always have. The EU assessment report confirms a large body of literature describing peppermint leaf tinctures, liquid extracts, and infusions used singly and in combination products, in documented use for at least 30 years across European countries. 30 years is the minimum threshold for what European pharmaceutical regulation considers established traditional use. Peppermint leaf, this actual documented history of use in Europe, is approximately 3,000 years. The regulatory floor is set considerably below the historical ceiling, but the floor is there, and it is solid. And it means that peppermint leaf preparations are not in the ambiguous category of remedies that exist in a regulatory gray area, tolerated but not endorsed. They are recognized, formally assessed, entered into the official record of European herbal medicine as legitimate traditional medicinal products for specified indications. The Egyptian physician who recorded the first leaf preparation for the stomach in 1550 BCE would, I think, have found the bureaucratic machinery of modern pharmaceutical regulation somewhat bewildering, but he would have recognized the conclusion it arrived at. He had arrived at it himself by a more direct route without the committee meetings. The dispensary is a particular kind of document, not a pharmacopoeia, which lists what is officially recognized, how it should be prepared to a standard, not a herbal, which records the tradition and the law alongside the medicine. A dispensary is something between the two, a practical reference for the working physician, an apothecary describing what is available, what it does, how to use it, and what to expect. It is the literature of the shop counter, the reference you reach for when a patient is in front of you and you need to confirm a dose or recall an indication. The American dispensatories of the 19th century are particularly useful historical documents because they represent the moment when the European apothecary tradition, transplanted to a new country, was consolidating its knowledge into authoritative texts appropriate to the American practice of medicine. They drew on European sources and on the considerable practical experience that American physicians and apothecaries had accumulated since the colonial period. They are not theoretical documents. They are records of what working practitioners found useful. The United States Dispensatory of 1848 describes peppermint as a very grateful aromatic stimulant. The word grateful in this context carries its older meaning: pleasing, welcome, well received by the system. It suggests a medicine that the body accepts without resistance, that does its work without the patient needing to be persuaded through the unpleasantness of the preparation. The dispensatory recommends it to allay nausea, to relieve spasmodic pains of the stomach and bowels, to expel gas, and to mask the unpleasant flavors of other medicines. These four indications in a single sentence represent the full breadth of peppermint's practical role in the 19th century American dispensary. The first three are the therapeutic applications that we have been tracing since Egypt. The fourth, the masking of unpleasant medicine flavors, is a use that is less often discussed in the formal record, but that was, in practical terms, one of peppermint's most valued contributions to daily apothecary work. The medicines of that era were frequently disagreeable to taste. Peppermint made them possible to administer. A separate 19th century description of the herb goes further than the dispensatory's clinical precision. It states that peppermint restores the functions of the stomach, promotes digestion, stops vomiting, cures the hiccups, relieves flatulent colic, addresses hysterical depressions, and manages other like complaints. The phrase hysterical depressions is the language of the period for what we might now describe as anxiety presenting with physical symptoms. The nervous stomach, the functional digestive complaint that has its origins in emotional distress rather than in any organic pathology. Peppermint's inclusion in this category is the 19th century's version of what Boerhaave had suggested in the 17th, that the herb's effects extend beyond the physical gut to the nervous system that governs it. The same text notes that the fresh herb was considered especially useful in treating cholera in children. Cholera, in the 19th century, was not a mild complaint to be managed with household remedies. It was a disease of devastating speed and severity. And the fact that peppermint was included in its management reflects both the desperate conditions of its epidemics and the genuine observation that its antispasmodic and antiemetic properties could offer some palliative support to the digestive system under acute assault. King's American Dispensary, the comprehensive reference that became one of the most authoritative texts of eclectic medicine in the latter half of the 19th century, assembled a description of peppermint that consolidates the full vocabulary of its therapeutic classification. A powerful diffusive stimulant, antispasmodic, carminative, stomachic, and notably credited with antiseptic properties. The antimicrobial character of the volatile oils that we have discussed in the context of oral hygiene and wound care was here being recognized in the formal dispensatory record as a genuine contribution to the herb's therapeutic profile. King's recommended peppermint for gastrodynia. The formal term for stomach pain, for flatulent colic, for hysteria in its 19th century sense, for gastric spasms, for the griping that accompanied the use of strong cathartic medicines, for nausea and vomiting, and for the role of flavor masking agent in compound preparations. The list is comprehensive. It represents the accumulated clinical experience of generations of eclectic practitioners who had used this herb in practice, observed what it did, and recorded their observations in the most widely consulted reference of their tradition. The full range of oral indications recorded in the historical medicinal summaries of this period includes flatulent colic, dyspepsia, stomach cramps and spasms, nausea, vomiting, morning sickness, and dysmenorrhea. That last painful menstruation connects the 19th century dispensary record to the folk herbalism we discussed earlier, which had long used peppermint leaf tea as a mild analgesic and antispasmodic for menstrual cramps. The dispensaries are confirming the folk tradition, translating it into professional language and giving it the endorsement of formal medical authority, but confirming rather than correcting what the household practitioners had known. For the respiratory passages, the dispensatory tradition recorded inhalation of peppermint steam for the coughs of bronchitis and pneumonia, and to induce perspiration at the onset of colds. The diaphotic use. The hot infusion and the steam treatment, taken at the first sign of a cold to promote sweating and move the illness through, is present here as it has been present in every tradition we have visited. And for the mouth and throat, washes and pastilles, for conditions of the oral cavity and the oropharynx, the formal anatomical name for the back of the throat and the upper airway, anodyne preparations. The pain-relieving gargle, now carrying the endorsement of the dispensatory literature, alongside the ancient practice of monks rinsing their mouths and patients, gargling against sore throats in every century. Since the Middle Ages, what the 19th century dispensaries accomplished in their careful and comprehensive way was the crystallization of everything that 3,000 years of practice had discovered about peppermint into the authoritative reference language of professional medicine. They did not add much that was genuinely new. They confirmed, classified, and formalized. They gave the tradition the vocabulary it needed to survive the transition into an era of increasingly professionalized medicine, in which remedies without formal documentation risked being dismissed as mere folk practice. Peppermint arrived in the dispensaries with its credentials fully intact. It had nothing to apologize for and a great deal to recommend it. The dispensatory authors, to their credit, recognized both. There is a particular satisfaction for a practitioner of long experience in watching the mechanisms of what one has always known to work be slowly uncovered and described. Not because the description is necessary for the practice has been functioning adequately without it for 3,000 years, but because there is a particular kind of confirmation that comes from understanding not merely that a thing works, but precisely how and why it does so. It is the difference between knowing a patient will recover and being able to explain the sequence of events that leads to their recovery. Both are useful. The explanation adds a dimension to the knowledge that deepens it without replacing it. Modern pharmacology has spent the better part of the 20th and 21st centuries doing exactly this for peppermint, uncovering the mechanisms behind observations that practitioners have been recording since the Egyptian medical texts. And the results, I am pleased to report, are largely confirmatory. The tradition was paying attention to real effects. The mechanisms are now described with a precision that the tradition could not have anticipated, but the effects themselves were accurately observed. The antispasmodic action that is peppermint's most consistent traditional application, the relief of cramp and spasm in the digestive tract, the easing of colic, the settling of the gut that rise in distress, has been characterized at the cellular level with considerable clarity. Peppermint leaf extracts, and the oil distilled from those leaves relax smooth muscle in the gastrointestinal wall by inhibiting the movement of calcium ions into the muscle cells. Smooth muscle contraction requires calcium. When calcium cannot enter the cell in sufficient quantity, the muscle cannot contract with its normal force, the spasm releases, the cramp eases. This is the same mechanism exploited by certain pharmaceutical antispasmodic drugs. Peppermint reaches it through a different chemical route through the volatile compounds concentrated in the leaf, but the result at the cellular level is the same. Experiments on isolated intestinal tissue, guinea pig ileum, rabbit jejunum, the standard preparations of pharmacological research have shown that peppermint oil and its primary constituent mental block voltage, dependent calcium channels, and reverse the contraction induced by acetylcholine, the chemical that the nervous system uses to signal the gut to contract. The mechanism is clear, reproducible, and directly explanatory of the antispasmodic tradition. The same inhibition of calcium currents has been observed in cardiac muscle and in neuronal tissue. This is a detail worth noting carefully, because it indicates that the leaf's active compounds interact with systems beyond the gut. At pharmacological doses, the concentrations used in laboratory experiments, rather than in a cup of tea, peppermint's constituents can affect the heart and the nervous system directly. This is relevant to the safety considerations that responsible practitioners have always attached to the herb, particularly regarding concentrated preparations in vulnerable patients. It is also relevant to the older observations about peppermint's nervous system effects, Boer-Harvey's suggestion of neurological attributions, the classification as a nervine, a folk use for psychological complaints in children. These were not imaginative extrapolations. They were observations of real effects that now have partial mechanistic explanation. Modern reviews of peppermint's effects on the digestive system have confirmed what the traditional record described as a whole tract remedy. The leaf-derived preparations affect the esophagus, the stomach, the small bowel, the gallbladder, and the colon, each section of the digestive passage responding to the antispasmodic and other properties of the herb in ways that validate the breadth of the historical indications. The choletic activity, the promotion of bile flow, that the British Herbal Compendium listed for biliary disorders has been documented pharmacologically. The reduction in tone of the lower esophageal sphincter, the valve between the esophagus and the stomach, has also been documented, which explains both the traditional use for reflux complaints and the caution that modern regulatory bodies attach to its use in patients with existing reflux disease. The same relaxation that relieves spasm in the gut can, in that particular location, make reflux worse rather than better. It is a reminder that antispasmodic action is not uniformly beneficial in every part of the system. Beyond the smooth muscle effects, modern research has identified a further mechanism that speaks to some of the most interesting aspects of the traditional record. Peppermint appears to modulate visceral sensitivity, the way the gut perceives and reports its own discomfort to the brain through interaction with what are called transient receptor potential channels. These are sensory receptors distributed throughout the gut and nervous system that respond to temperature, to chemical stimuli, and to mechanical pressure. Menthol activates the cold-sensitive members of this family, which is why peppermint produces a sensation of coolness. But the interaction also affects the way the gut reports pain and discomfort to the central nervous system, reducing the sensitivity of visceral pain pathways. This is the mechanism behind peppermint's well-established role in irritable bowel syndrome, the complex multifactorial condition in which the gut is hypersensitive, reporting ordinary digestive processes as painful and distressing. The enteric-coated peppermint oil capsules that modern gastroenterology uses for this condition work not only by relaxing smooth muscle, but by turning down the volume at which the gut speaks to the brain. The patient's gut does not cease its activity. It simply becomes less insistent about reporting that activity as pain. The same pathway research has shed light on the mood and cognitive effects that the tradition has long attributed to peppermint. The older observations, Boerhaave's suggestion of effects on depressive states, the Nervine classification, the folk use for psychological complaints, the improvement in mood and cognitive function noted in clinical studies are now partly explained by the herb's interaction with central and enteric nervous system pathways that govern not only sensation but emotional tone. The gut-brain connection, which modern research has established as a genuine and significant bidirectional communication system, is relevant here. A herb that affects visceral sensitivity and enteric nervous system function will, through that pathway, have effects that reach the brain and influence mood and cognition. Peppermint's effects on the nervous system are not simply the pleasant side effects of a digestive remedy. They are part of the same integrated action. The antioxidant properties of peppermint leaf preparations have been characterized through systematic analysis of the polyphenol compounds concentrated in the dried leaf. Rosmarinic acid is among the most abundant of these, a compound with well-documented anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity that is found across several aromatic herbs and that contributes, in peppermint, to effects that go beyond what the volatile oils alone can explain. Studies of commercial peppermint tea infusions from multiple countries have found measurable levels of rosmarinic acid and related polyphenols in the prepared drink. The anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity of the cup of tea is not trivial. It is the product of real chemistry acting on real biology. The neuroprotective effects observed in cell models, reduced oxidative damage to neuronal cells, begin to offer a biochemical basis for the invigorating and nervine reputation that the tradition has always attributed to the herb. The cell that is protected from oxidative damage functions better. The nervous system that is less inflamed is less dysregulated. These are not dramatic, rapid effects of the kind that pharmaceutical drugs are designed to produce. They are the slow, accumulating effects of regular use of a plant rich in antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds. The kind of effects that reveal themselves not in a single dramatic cure, but in the gradual observation that people who use this herb regularly seem to do better over time. The hepatoprotective effects that experimental work has identified, a protective action against certain toxic insults to liver cells, extend the traditional digestive support into territory that connects peppermint, unexpectedly, to the liver tonic tradition that we have discussed in the context of other herbs. The liver herb and the digestive carminative are not, it turns out, entirely separate categories. A herb that supports the liver's management of toxic burden contributes indirectly to the same digestive health that its more direct antispasmodic effects produce. The antimicrobial story is perhaps the most directly vindicating for the traditional record. Modern pharmacological reviews report significant antimicrobial and antiviral activities in peppermint preparations. Activities now understood to derive from the volatile oils and polyphenol compounds concentrated in the leaf. Studies of peppermint infusions have demonstrated measurable antimicrobial activity against chlamydia pneumoniae in laboratory conditions, supporting the traditional use of peppermint leaf tea for acute respiratory infections. The old habit of giving peppermint tea or lozenges for influenza, catarrh, and oral throat infections. The Civil War lozenge, the Victorian household remedy, the monastery gargle, was not wishful thinking. It was the application of genuine antimicrobial chemistry to infections that were susceptible to it. The antiviral activity extends the traditional anti-infective uses in ways that the tradition itself could not have anticipated. The distinction between bacterial and viral infection was not available to practitioners before the modern era. They knew that peppermint helped with the kinds of illness they called colds and influenza, without knowing whether the organisms involved were what we now call bacteria or viruses. The modern demonstration of antiviral activity against relevant pathogens suggests that the herb was providing genuine anti-infective support in both categories simultaneously, without the practitioner needing to make the distinction. The biopesticidal and larvicidal activities documented in modern research provide the mechanistic basis for something that every household that has kept mint near the kitchen window has informally observed. Insects find it unwelcoming. The volatile compounds that give peppermint its character are genuinely toxic to certain insects and their larvae. The frontier American households strewing crushed mint on ant trails and hanging bundles in doorways were working with real insecticidal chemistry. The monks keeping mint near the grain stores were not simply relying on superstition. The property exists. It is now characterized. It was always real. Veterinary applications confirm an even older tradition. Experimental and practical work in veterinary medicine has demonstrated that peppermint oil has significant anthelmintic efficacy. It kills intestinal worms against gastrointestinal nematodes in sheep. The antiparasitic tradition that runs from Alexander of Tralles in the 6th century through the Babylonian Talmud formula, through the folk medicine records of every culture that has used the mint family against intestinal worms, has arrived at modern veterinary research, demonstrating the same effect in controlled conditions. Peppermint is also used in veterinary practice against coccidiosis in poultry, against diarrhea in piglets, and against ticks and fungal infections in companion animals. The antimicrobial and antiparasitic applications of the herb applied in the 21st century to non-human patients are the continuation of practices that the human medical tradition had established 2,000 years earlier. Let us turn to the clinical trials, because these represent the highest standard of evidence that the modern period requires. And peppermint has met that standard in several areas that are directly relevant to its traditional record. The management of dysmenorrhea, painful menstruation, has been the subject of rigorous clinical investigation. A systematic review of the evidence concludes that peppermint preparations can significantly reduce pain in primary dysmenorrhea. This is the folk use that the dispensaries recorded, that traditional herbalism prescribed leaf tea for, that the historical sources listed alongside menstrual cramps in the long catalogue of peppermint's oral indications. The review covers clinical trials that have put numbers to what the tradition described in qualitative terms. One such trial compared oral peppermint capsules directly with mefenamic acid, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug commonly prescribed for menstrual pain. The peppermint preparation reduced menstrual cramp severity as effectively as the pharmaceutical, with fewer reports of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea as side effects. This is a significant finding, not because it suggests that peppermint should replace pharmaceutical analgesia in all circumstances. The severity of individual dysmenorrhea varies widely, and some presentations require stronger intervention. But because it demonstrates that the traditional preparation, properly formulated and dosed, produces pain relief comparable to a standard pharmaceutical analgesic for the same indication, with a better tolerability profile. Aromatherapy massage, using diluted peppermint oil applied over the lower abdomen for several days before menstruation, significantly reduced pain intensity and improved daily functioning in adolescents. This is the external application that the tradition has always practiced alongside the internal one, the counter-irritant plaster on the skin, the soothing compress, the herb working from the outside rather than the inside in clinical trial conditions, with measurable outcomes rather than anecdotal reports. It works. A further trial found that peppermint oil capsules taken for 10 days before menstruation improved emotional, behavioral, and physical symptoms of premenstrual syndrome, with effects extending beyond simple pain relief into mood and general well-being. This is the nervous system dimension. The neuromodulatory effects that Bohahaviv observed, that the Nervine classification described, that folk medicine attributed to mild peppermint preparations, demonstrable in a properly controlled clinical trial, measuring outcomes that go beyond the physical to include emotional and cognitive function. The infant colic evidence is worth examining carefully because it sits at the intersection of the most well-established traditional use and the most significant modern safety concern, and it deserves a thoughtful account rather than a simple resolution in either direction. A double-blind crossover clinical trial in infants used drops prepared from Mentha piperita leaves and found the peppermint preparation as effective as simethicone, the pharmaceutical agent most commonly recommended for infant colic. In reducing colic episodes and crying time, each infant received 1 drop per kilogram of body weight daily for 7 days. The preparation was leaf-based, carefully standardized. The trial was rigorous in its design. The result was clear. Peppermint performed comparably to the pharmaceutical standard. The complication is that the pharmaceutical standard itself has a problem. Simethicone, when examined in properly controlled trials, shows no benefit over placebo for infant colic. If simethicone does not work and peppermint performs as well as simethicone, the clinical significance of the comparison is uncertain. The peppermint may be genuinely effective. It may be as ineffective as the comparator. The trial design does not fully resolve this question. A subsequent study of a multi-herb preparation combining chamomile, fennel, lemon balm, and peppermint reported improvement in colic symptoms and acceptable safety in infants. These are all herbs with carminative and antispasmodic traditions extending back centuries. The combination is the kind of formula that any competent apothecary would have compounded for the same complaint in any period of the last 300 years. The safety data from the trial provides reassurance about the leaf-based preparation of the doses used. The complication enters with the concentrated oil. The American Academy of Pediatrics specifically warns against the use of peppermint oil in infants. This is the appropriate regulatory caution for a concentrated preparation of an active compound in a vulnerable population. Menthol at sufficient doses can suppress respiration, a serious concern in infants whose respiratory regulation is less robust than in older patients. The oil is not the leaf tea, the concentration is not the same, the safety profile is not the same. The divergence between the traditional practice of giving dilute peppermint preparations to infants and the modern regulatory caution against peppermint oil is, at its root, a divergence about concentration and form, rather than about the herb itself. The tradition used dilute infusions. The safety warning applies to the oil. These are different preparations, and conflating them does justice to neither the tradition nor the safety concern. The practitioner who reaches for a very mild leaf infusion for a colicky infant is not doing the same thing as the one who applies concentrated peppermint oil. The tradition, in its older household form, was working at doses that the modern safety literature does not actually address. The irritable bowel syndrome evidence represents perhaps the most robust modern clinical confirmation of peppermint's traditional role. Enteric, coated peppermint oil capsules, designed to release their contents in the small intestine rather than the stomach, delivering the antispasmodic action to the portion of the tract most relevant in IBS, have been studied in multiple controlled trials and reviewed in systematic analyses. The evidence for benefit in reducing abdominal pain, bloating, and the overall symptom burden of IBS is consistent and clinically meaningful. This is the carminative and antispasmodic tradition, formulated with modern pharmaceutical precision to deliver the active constituents to the site of action in a controlled and reliable way. The enteric coating is new. The mechanism is the calcium channel inhibition we discussed earlier. The indication is the same cramping, bloating, and digestive distress that the 1848 US dispensary called spasmodic pains of the stomach and bowels, and that the Egyptian medical text addressed 3,000 years before that. What the modern science has added in some is a vocabulary and a mechanistic understanding that the tradition lacked but did not need in order to function effectively. Calcium channel inhibition explains the antispasmodic action. TRP channel modulation explains the visceral sensitivity effects and the cooling sensation. Polyphenol activity explains the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. Antimicrobial and antiviral compound characterization explains the traditional anti-infective uses. Anthelmintic activity explains the anti-parasitic tradition. Each of these characterizations confirms rather than contradicts what practitioners from Tyers of Amida to the authors of King's American Dispensary had observed by the simpler and slower method of careful attention to outcomes. The tradition was not guessing. It was observing, recording, and passing the knowledge forward. The mechanisms were always there, operating in the leaf, whether or not anyone knew how to describe them. The 3,000 years of consistent practice did not require the mechanistic account to be valid. But the mechanistic account, now that it exists, makes the tradition easier to understand, easier to defend in the language of modern medicine, and easier to extend with appropriate confidence into new applications. The broad array of activities now documented in the modern literature: antioxidant, antimicrobial, antiviral, anti-inflammatory, antispasmodic, analgesic, neuromodulatory, hepatoprotective, biopesticidal, and more, is the contemporary account of what the older tradition described as a powerful, diffusive stimulant, carminative, nervine, and antiseptic. The vocabulary is entirely different. The plant is the same. The jar on the third shelf of this shop contains what it has always contained. The label reads Peppermint, Mentha expiperita, the leaf of a sterile hybrid that cannot produce seeds and must be carried forward, cutting by cutting, generation by generation, by the deliberate hands of people who understand what they are keeping. 3,000 years of those hands. And the leaf at the end of them still doing what it has always done. We are nearly at the end of the inventory. The candles have burned low. The shop has grown quieter, if that is possible, than it was when we began. And we have arrived at the point in any account of a plant's history where the past and the present meet, where the long thread of accumulated practice touches the world as it currently stands. For peppermint, that meeting point is not a conclusion, it is a continuation. Peppermint tea is now among the most widely consumed single-ingredient herbal tisanes in the world. Not one of the most popular, among the most popular. In a world where the herbal tea market encompasses hundreds of species from every continent. The leaf of this particular hybrid, the sterile cross of watermint and spearmint, that cannot produce seeds and must be propagated by hand, has risen to the top of the category by the simple mechanism of consistently proving itself to the people who drink it. The cultivation that drives this consumption spans temperate Europe, Asia, the United States, India, and the Mediterranean countries. The commercial production that began with the English herb gardens of the mid-18th century, that moved to the American peppermint kings of New England and Michigan in the 19th, has now spread across the globe in response to a demand that shows no sign of diminishing. Every cup of peppermint tea sold in a supermarket, every lozenge dispensed in a pharmacy, every enteric-coated capsule prescribed for irritable bowel syndrome, begins with a leaf grown somewhere in this network of cultivation. The leaf that was placed in an Egyptian tomb is now a global agricultural commodity. And yet the household use has not been displaced by the commercial one. It runs alongside it, as it always has. The midwife recommending a strong brew of peppermint tea for menstrual cramps is not citing clinical trials. She is passing forward the same knowledge that folk herbalists and household healers have passed forward for as long as women have been managing the pain of difficult periods with whatever the garden offered. The cup of tea made in the kitchen at 11 o'clock on a difficult evening is not a pharmaceutical intervention. It is the continuation of a tradition so old that its origins are beyond reliable documentation. Women have used mint teas for painful periods across cultures and centuries in ways that the historical record can only partially capture, because much of this knowledge was held in practice rather than written down. The midwife's knowledge, the mother's knowledge, the knowledge passed between neighbors and between generations in the kind of quiet, practical exchange that does not usually make it into the medical texts, but that constitutes, across the span of history, the majority of how herbal knowledge has actually been preserved and transmitted. The modern ethnomedicinal record, the surveys and reviews that document what people are actually using herbs for in communities across the world, confirms that peppermint leaf infusions continue to be used worldwide for fever, for chills, for congested airways, the same diaphoretic and decongestant applications that the household medicine of every century has employed, the same hot tea under blankets, the same steam bowl over the sink, the same warming cup at the first sign of a cold, that the practitioners of every previous era recommended. For sore throat and oral inflammation, warm peppermint tea and gargles continue in regular use, with the volatile components providing the mild antimicrobial action that the monastic scribes of the Middle Ages could not have characterized but were observing accurately. Modern herbal gargle recipes still employ peppermint leaves for what one contemporary herbal source describes as gently allaying the troubles of the mind and body while soothing the throat. That phrase, the troubles of the mind and body together, addressed by a single preparation, is the Nervine tradition speaking in contemporary language. The same recognition that the mint does not only soothe the throat, but settles something in the person that holds the throat. Contemporary herbalists who have spent careers working with plants and with patients continue to reach for peppermint leaf for what they describe as the nervous stomach, the digestive complaint that is rooted in anxiety, in stress, in the state of a mind that is too busy, in a gut that responds to that business with cramping, bloating, and discomfort. Richard Whelan, among other practicing herbalists, cites peppermint leaf specifically for anxiety-related gut symptoms and for what he calls stuck digestive states, a phrase that the older tradition would have recognized immediately, that the German commissionee would have called cramp-like complaints of the gastrointestinal tract, and that the Egyptian physician would have described simply as complaints of the stomach. The vocabulary changes with every generation, the observation does not. Modern herbal monographs and contemporary phytotherapy reviews maintain peppermint leaf's classification as a traditional herbal medicinal product for dyspepsia and flatulence, explicitly grounding this designation in long-standing historical use. The EU monograph that we discussed in the regulatory section is a living document. It has been revised and updated as new evidence accumulates. But its core recognition of the dried leaf as a legitimate medicinal substance for these indications has been maintained and confirmed, rather than weakened by scrutiny. Contemporary clinical and pharmacological research is effectively revalidating, one indication at a time, the apothecary uses that herbalists, midwives, and physicians attributed to peppermint leaves across the centuries. The menstrual cramp evidence revalidates the folk gynecological tradition. The IBS trials revalidate the carminative and antispasmodic tradition. The functional dyspepsia research revalidates the stomachic and digestive tradition. Each piece of modern evidence arrives at a conclusion that the older record had already stated by a different route and with a different quality of proof. But to the same destination. The 2020 assessment report produced by the European Medicines Agency on Mentha X piperitofolium, the dried leaf makes a statement that I want to quote in the spirit in which it was written, because it summarizes, in the language of modern pharmaceutical regulation, what we have been tracing across this entire evening. The report states that peppermint's medicinal reputation originates in antiquity, in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome, and has persisted unbroken into regulated modern herbal medicine, with the leaf remaining a central part of the pharmacopoeia. Unbroken, that is the word the regulatory document uses. Not revived, not rediscovered, not rehabilitated after a period of disuse, unbroken. The thread from the Egyptian medical text of 1550 BCE to the EMA assessment report of 2020 CE has not been cut at any point in its 3,500 years. It has been thinned, sometimes, in periods when other priorities dominated medical thinking. It has been translated into different vocabularies as the frameworks for understanding medicine shifted. It has been adapted to new forms as the technology of preparation evolved from the simple leaf infusion to the enteric coated capsule. But it has never been broken. The knowledge has been in continuous use, in continuous transmission, from the moment it was first written down. There is something worth sitting with in that word. Unbroken, in a world where so much knowledge has been lost, where so many traditions have been interrupted, where the accumulated observation of generations can disappear when the conditions that held it cease to exist. The continuity of peppermint's medicinal record is not something to pass over quickly. It survived the fall of Rome. It survived the disruptions of the early medieval period. It survived the plague years, the wars, the burning of libraries, the dissolution of the monasteries that had been among its most careful custodians. It crossed oceans in the pockets of settlers who could not imagine a garden without it. It traveled in the pages of dispensatories, carried to new continents. It persisted in the household knowledge of women who never wrote anything down but who knew, because their mothers had known and their mothers' mothers before them, that the mint in the garden was for the stomach and the head in the difficult days of the month and the sick child who needed something gentle and reliable. And it is here now, in this jar, on this shelf, where it has been, in one form or another, in shops like this one, since before the word apothecary existed. Contemporary sources still promote peppermint for digestive comfort, for mild symptom relief, for the everyday management of the ordinary human complaints that have not changed in character since the first person noticed that a particular leaf, rubbed between the fingers and consumed, made the stomach easier and the head clearer. The wellness industry has adopted peppermint with enthusiasm, placing it in products that range from the rigorously evidence-based to the merely fashionable. This is not new. Peppermint has always attracted commercial enthusiasm alongside genuine medicinal application. The confectionery trade of the 18th century was no less commercially motivated than the wellness product manufacturers of the 21st. The herb survives both. Its properties do not depend on the sincerity of whoever is selling it. What matters is that the leaf is there, that it is prepared with some care and some knowledge of what it is and what it does, that the person who receives it has a reasonable understanding of what they are taking and why. The rest, the marketing language, the fashionable framing, the wellness vocabulary that will seem dated in 20 years, as every wellness vocabulary eventually does, is the surface of the thing. The substance is the same as it has always been. We have come a very long way this evening, from the tombs of Egypt to the dispensaries of the American frontier, from the myth of Minthov to the calcium channel, research of modern pharmacology, from the monk's tooth powder to the enteric-coated capsule, from the Greek banquet table to the Tuareg tea ceremony to the suburban kitchen at midnight, and through all of it, the same leaf, the same sharp, clarifying impossible to ignore smell, the same cooling on the tongue, the same settling in the stomach, the same clearing in the head, the same quiet reassurance that something reliable has been reached for and will do what it has always done. The jar goes back on the third shelf. Third from the left, near the window, brown ceramic, unremarkable. The label says simply peppermint. You have almost certainly walked past this plant today without thinking very much about it at all. Now perhaps you will think a little more. Sleep? Well. And so the inventory is complete for this evening. The jar goes back to the third shelf, third from the left, near the window. Brown ceramic, unremarkable to look at. The label reads simply Peppermint, Mentha ex piperita, a hybrid that cannot produce seeds, a plant that must be carried forward, cutting by cutting, generation by generation, by the deliberate hands of people who understand what they are keeping. We began in Egypt, in the deep stillness of tombs, sealed 3,000 years ago, where dried leaves were considered worth placing alongside the dead. We traveled through Greece and Rome, through myth and medicine and the banquet table, through Persia and Arabia, and China and the monasteries of medieval Europe, across the Atlantic in a settler's pocket, into the dispensaries of a new nation and the pharmacopoeias of the old world, and at last into the laboratories of modern pharmacology, where the mechanisms behind what 3,000 years of practitioners had carefully observed were finally, slowly confirmed. The calcium channel that the antispasmodic relieves, the cold receptor that produces the cooling sensation, the polyphenols that reduce inflammation, the antimicrobial compounds that were in every lozenge and gargle and steam bowl, doing their work whether anyone knew why or not. 3,000 years of unbroken use. Not revived, not rediscovered, unbroken. That word belongs to peppermint more honestly than to almost any other substance on this shelf, and it should belong to you now as well, to the knowledge you carry with you out of this shop tonight. The next time you walk past mint in a garden, or hold a cup of peppermint tea, or catch that sharp and clarifying smell that stops you mid-thought and pulls your full attention into your nose, you will know something of what you are holding. You are holding 3,000 years of careful observation. 3,000 years of hands reaching for the same jar, in the same spirit, for many of the same reasons. Egyptian physicians and Greek hosts and Roman soldiers and medieval monks and Victorian households and frontier settlers and modern pharmacologists, all looking at the same leaf and arriving, by their different routes, at the same considered conclusion. This is worth keeping. I hope the history has settled around you comfortably this evening. I hope the shop has been a good place to spend these hours, and I hope, most sincerely, as one who has spent 40 years in the business of helping people feel better, that you are, by now, very nearly asleep. The fire is low. The jars are quiet on their shelves. The street outside is still. There is nothing that requires your attention tonight. The inventory is done. The candles can go out. Sleep well. And thank you, genuinely for finding your way to this shop.